Hey everyone, welcome back to the Not Just Politics podcast. The following is a conversation with Jeremiah Cutright and Dr. Brandon Mullen. Jeremiah is a senior at the University of Pittsburgh studying environmental studies. He is the author of the Energy Predicament book and Substack, and he is the president of the Bridge USA chapter at Pitt. Dr. Brandon Mullen is an associate professor of physics at Point Park University. We sat down to discuss the contents of Jeremiah's book, climate change, space exploration, and more. This was a fun conversation. I'm very grateful for these two and their time, and I hope you enjoy. Well, thank you both for doing this. This has been a long time coming. We planned this back in September.
Yeah, we
Early
were so young
September.
then.
We were so young back then.
Ambitious.
The semester was so young.
I hadn't had all my hopes and dreams crushed by this semester.
We were still, I hadn't gone full doomer mode yet.
Mhm.
I hadn't gone into my super cynical doomer spiral that happened right before Thanksgiving break.
That's a really great selling point for his book.
That is a great selling point. Well, folks, we're here today. We're here today to talk about The Energy Predicament by Jeremiah Cutright, the book that has been plugged on this show.
Oh, there's a camera over there.
But there is a camera.
I was like, well, who are you showing the book to?
Who's the book being shown to? No, the book is being shown to the people. I guess I
Person's
could.
sundowning a little bit over here.
Yeah. Could be, but the book that's been plugged on this show. And we're here to talk about it. We're here to talk about all things climate change, energy consumption, aliens, other stuff as well.
I mean, I think that's about everything.
It's everything you could talk about.
Yeah.
What is it, like the life, the universe, and everything?
Meaning, 42.
Yeah,
Yeah.
42. We're going to
Yeah.
talk about that.
Yeah.
That'll be a lot of fun. Anyway, let's jump right into this. So I want to start with,
Excuse me.
if we can start with some of the climate orthodoxy that's happening in our society. What are some things that the climate orthodoxy gets right? What's some stuff that it gets wrong? And I guess whoever wants to start off.
Well, I'm going to defer to the person who literally wrote the book on this topic. So, Jeremiah.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the climate orthodoxy, as you put it, like the climate movement and the environmental movement as a whole, is an important movement, right? It's important that we do start caring about these issues. I'm very passionate about these issues. Where I think it goes wrong is that people develop this misconception that it's the literal end of the world, right? I think that's where we get into doomism, and that's just simply unproductive. So I think it's going in the right direction in the sense that, hey, there's an important issue that we need to start caring about, but it goes too far sometimes. And there's an ideal middle ground where, I just think is where reality lies is the best way to approach it, because we need to be concerned to a proportional extent to the threat. That's my take.
Okay. Any thoughts on that, Doctor?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I'm going to agree with you throughout most of this conversation. But, being pragmatic, being realistic, and being informed, I think are the most important things here. When I was reading this book, I was reflecting back to when I remember when Fukushima happened. And as soon as that happened, I was like, well, wait, can I swear during this podcast?
Of course, yeah.
I was
you're allowed to
like,
swear.
shit,
Yeah.
there goes nuclear.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
people are just going to completely turn against it. And that was around the same time I think the Yankee reactor shut down in New England. And that was from a very, and I'm a pretty crunchy person myself, but, you can go way too far that direction. That was, a really crunchy group who brought about the end of that. And it's like, I'm like, your heart is in the right place. I see where you're getting at, but you need to think a little bit more long term.
Right.
And I think, one of the things that I enjoyed about this book is that, there's an actual strategy involved of, here's the sources of energy that we're going to need at certain times to get us, where we want to go in 100 years. So I think having that vision beyond Mother Gaia, hooray, we've got to articulate that and put some steps forward.
Sure.
And I think nuclear is kind of the prime example in this, and that's why I spend so much time talking about it in the book as well, because, again, it is kind of, I still don't fully understand why this is, but a lot of time when we go too far into the environmentalism in the sense that we're exaggerating the problem, I find that a lot of those same people also exaggerate the issue with other things, including nuclear. And when you exaggerate the issue of nuclear, like nuclear waste, nuclear disasters, these kind of things, Fukushima is the perfect example. we can, just say, oh, actually, any of the small risks are all too large, right? They all get disproportionately, blown up, I guess. And that hurts us in a very tangible way, in the sense that it takes away very good possible sources of clean energy.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to blame The Simpsons on this because I didn't realize how much it had colored my perception of nuclear waste. I was thinking barrels of sludge and Blinky the three-eyed fish, and then
And the death count. Sorry, Doctor.
No, that's all right. I'm trying to look for my notes because I wrote this down because I was like, oh, it's really that much. It's the volume of space that you need to house the waste that's produced is what a soccer pitch times a 3-floor building.
Yeah.
That volume. I was like, that is not very much.
Of solid waste.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's
And
like
that's from
easily contained.
Yeah, it's not like frothing liquid that's going to turn you into a Hulk monster or something. It's
Right.
like it's manageable solid waste.
Now, this is the high level waste,
Yeah.
but that's like, what people stereotypically think in like the yellow radioactive
Yeah.
containers in The Simpsons and stuff, right?
So
There
that's-
is other waste, but it's much less of a concern.
Yeah.
And that's from a standard reactor.
This is globally.
Oh, globally,
like
that's
global
it.
Yeah.
Volume, yeah.
That
It's a soccer field-sized building 3 stories high.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's an insanely small amount of waste. I mean, it's a slightly old figure at this point. I think it was 2015 or 2016 is when I was quoting that too. But, that was over like a 60-year time period. So it hasn't
Yeah.
changed much by this
Yeah.
point.
And I know you've got your misgivings about solar energy for good reason, but that also has a similar sort of misconception around it. Like if you take the amount of energy that we get from the sun, which is our primary driver of climate and literally everything on Earth, right? That's like 2 times 10 to the 17th watts, just about, and we use about a little under 2 times 10 to the 13th. So that's 1 part in 10,000 or 0.01%. So that's the amount of surface area, if you wanted to obtain all of your energy from solar, that you would need to cover. And if you just kind of game that out, that's about the size of, when you add some inefficiencies in absorption of the atmosphere, that's about the size of like Cuba or Oregon or something like that. So
Covered in solar panels.
yeah. So if you wanted to like say, okay, how much of an impact does our raw energy consumption, just ignoring for now all the indirect effects that we have in our atmosphere, it's actually like we're kind of a pitiful species. We don't use all that much compared to the primary driver of how Earth works, and that's the sun.
Yeah.
So it's, like all of these things amount to a surprisingly small amount of energy impact, at least at first glance, and we'll get into the indirect effects, which is like the primary concern in the next 100 years. But, that's only the starting point. Like if we keep ramping up our energy consumption, or use, I should more properly say, like we'll have to start to think about that in the long term.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is what you're hinting on, but if
Yeah.
we're looking like several hundred years out
Yeah.
at the rate of our energy growth, almost ironically, climate change is going to kind of go away as a concern and then come back as a concern, because like just the sheer amount of energy that we're using may be like ambient heating.
Yeah, exactly. Direct heating. It's funny. We jumped to the second law of thermodynamics first. This is like kind of the umbrella category for all of the climate effects that we have now. We have an indirect effect of our environment, and luckily, if we solve that first, we'll have another 100 years to solve this direct problem. But perhaps for this conversation, I don't know, Carson, you're in control of the car here. Do you want to talk more about in the next 100 years sort of problems before we get to the next 200 years?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you guys can jump in. Also, can I borrow your pen very quickly? Sorry, I forgot to bring a pencil with me over here. Gosh. I want to quickly touch on, so the death count from Fukushima is what?
One
One?
approximately, and that one death is a cleanup worker. I don't know
Okay.
all the specifics about it, I'll be honest, but
Okay.
I know that it's attributed to a single cleanup worker who got exposed to too much radiation, and they died of, I believe it was some sort of chest cancer. I can't remember exactly which one.
And 3 Mile Island is 0?
0, yeah. 3
And-
Mile Island, the total, like the average exposure among the population was less than a chest x-ray.
Really?
in radiological dose. So,
So
very, very small
Chernobyl's the worst one.
by far.
Worst one. Okay.
Not even close. Yeah.
And what's the death count on that?
It depends how you measure it.
Okay.
Via direct deaths, which is mostly through like the firefighters and the liquidators who went to help stop the fire at Chernobyl. We can certainly attribute at least around like 50 deaths to it. The WHO estimates that in the wider region of kind of Eastern Europe, we may see somewhere on the order of like 5,000 deaths from other types of cancers. But even in that statistic, that 5,000 is it's less than 1% of the experienced deaths from thyroid cancer in the sample as is, like business usual. So even that 5,000 is like a statistically insignificant amount in the bigger picture if we extrapolate it. And we can go really deep into all of this. We can get into like the way that radiation damage is calculated with it's called the nonlinear threshold model. We could go pretty deep into this, but that's the premise.
Thank you.
Carson has a pencil now.
I have a pencil now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. I've acquired a pencil. Okay. There's a lot there that you guys just jumped into.
Can I actually also say one other thing?
Of course.
One disaster that I did not talk about as much in the book as I would have liked to was also probably one of the least appreciated nuclear disasters ever, which was the disaster at Windscale, which was a nuclear incident in England in 1951, I believe it was.
Okay.
Basically like the first major nuclear accident, but it occurred in a time before the general populace was, say, concerned about nuclear energy, and it just never gained any popular momentum. I mean, Windscale released way more radiation than 3 Mile Island, for example, though, and nobody talks about it. So
And what's the death? The death count on that one?
I don't know the death count. I don't know if there is a death count on it.
Okay. Well, I prefer that my nuclear meltdowns be appreciated. So I think that one needs to get a little more attention.
When was this one again?
I think it was 1951,
Okay.
maybe 1952. It was one of the first nuclear power plants ever. And I don't know enough about the disaster to really talk about it, honestly.
That's interesting.
But yeah, there are multiple nuclear incidents that, because of the time or the place they occurred, they may be just as large in like radiological release as some of these other disasters that we're, concerned about in our public consciousness, but nobody has ever heard of. So I think that's another, sort of evidence point that we can use to say there is some sort of irrational fear about nuclear energy, which I try to dispel in the book because I do see it as a very useful source of energy for us going forward.
And talk about that. You mentioned how the radiation is measured. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, are you asking in terms of, it's a very open question.
Yeah, no, I didn't mean to ask such an open question.
Okay.
I didn't know about this aspect of this.
Okay, so are you talking about the linear no threshold model that I mentioned before?
Sure,
Okay,
yeah.
so it's logical, but illogical, right? It seems to make sense up front, but in reality it doesn't. In the sense of, if we look at Chernobyl right now, I don't know the radiological release off the top of my head, but if it was a number of 100, right? And if that causes 50 deaths, the natural thing is for people to extrapolate that down, right? So if 100 causes 50 deaths, or let's just say 50 causes 50 deaths, then a dose of 1 will cause 1 death, right? That's the premise of this model. And that is simply, from all the studies that I've ever seen, that is just not true at all, because our biology, because radiation is ambient, right? It's a natural phenomenon. Our biology has learned to cope with limited doses of radiation without severe impacts on our biology. So you can't really extrapolate all these numbers down in the sense that you could with other sort of, chemicals or violence or things like that we're used to. So if 50 causes 50 deaths, then 1 might not cause any deaths, or 10 might not cause any deaths, right?
Oh, okay,
It's an S-curve in impact, so it's very, very minimal, and then it reaches a point where it overtakes our biology because it's so unnatural, is usually what it is, like at
Gotcha.
Chernobyl, that you see actually kind of like a spike in mortality. And then it levels off at the end because you're just dead if you get exposed to too much, frankly.
Yeah. And Is that why we can do chemotherapy and x-rays, even though we do have protection? Is that kind of the premise of like, even though that little bit of radiation goes through, it doesn't?
That's partially it. And we do take other just safety precautions in it, because the crazy thing about it is that even though, pretty much all of the experts at like the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and even the U.S.'s own Department of Energy personally and like publicly say that the linear no threshold, the LNT model, is pretty much junk science, it's still the default method of calculation around the world, right? So we still use it in our policies, even though we know that it's totally junk. And this is important for policy because of nuclear power.
What an interesting observation in all of that, because I feel like one of the main drawbacks of our species is our inability to think in any other mathematical way besides linear.
Exactly.
And like many of the things we're going to be discussing here are non-linear phenomena that we just can't predict well in our brains because we just can't think that way.
Right. Yeah. Humans are very bad at exponentials.
Yeah. Well, that's going to go into our Yelp review.
Yeah.
2 thumbs down for humans.
But it's very interesting to me, and it's frustrating too, because it has real world implications on the policy side, especially with things like nuclear. And I think we'll start to see it in terms of AI and some of these other developments as well, because these are all growing at exponentials. But in the terms of nuclear, it plays out in the sense that the amount of safety precautions we have in these reactors, which I want to be clear, like we need proper safety precautions.
Of course,
This is why Chernobyl was so bad, is because it did not have the proper confinement system that we have in the West. But it basically means that each nuclear reactor, which, these reactors can cost several $1 billion each. The ones in Georgia, I think they are averaging on like $7 or $8 billion per reactor right now that just got built. We're probably adding multiple billions of dollars in safety precautions and kind of backup material that's unnecessary to these reactors, artificially making them much, much more expensive than they would be otherwise in a more rational world.
So that's interesting. The LNT is used in all of the policy making, but we all know that it's junk science.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's whack. Okay, and Jeremiah, in the book you talk about how these new fourth and first of all, I have a podcaster monkey brain that took physics my senior year of high school. I can never remember the difference between fission and fusion. And you said there are both. So we don't have one of those we haven't figured out yet, right?
We don't have fusion. That's the sun.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're working on it.
Yeah.
So we have
it's always 30 years away. That's the joke.
So we have nuclear fission reactors.
That's correct.
Is that okay? And you've talked about the fact that those new generators are actually really safe compared to older models.
Yeah, which ones? Yes, but just one clarification on which you're talking.
Oh no,
because it's all gotten much safer over time.
Yeah, essentially, I'm saying like the fear over these things. I think in people's brains they still have a Chernobyl nuclear reactor in the back of their head. Yeah, like they have that in the back of their head, but in reality, these new reactors that can be built are going to be much safer than that.
Yeah, Dr. Mullen's the physicist here, so maybe you'd be better at explaining fission and fusion, kind of the fundamental differences between them. But I will say, in premise, fusion is just a much safer technology. Fission is kind of inherently unstable in the sense that it wants to run away from you. It relies on a chain reaction that's self-feeding. And fusion is almost the opposite. It's so difficult to make happen in the first place that, like you said, it's always 30 years away. We're just trying to get it to work in the first place. Whereas after the physics of fission started, it only took 12 years since the conception of the chain reaction for a nuclear bomb to be developed. And we've been working on fusion for almost 100 years at this point.
Yeah. I don't know how much more about fission you want me to explain, but it's basically like you start with large atoms like uranium, plutonium, and all that, and basically take a pool shot of a subatomic particle with them, knock it into a nucleus, split it up, particles go off, smack into other plutonium, uranium, whatever.
Okay.
Whatever you got, break it apart, and Yeah, that's all right. We're all sick today.
We're all getting over a sickness that's not COVID.
Yeah.
Fission is splitting the atom.
Yeah.
Fusion isn't.
Fusion
Fusion's
is
like
the
mashing them
inverse.
together.
Instead of going
It's
from
fusing
big to
atoms.
small, it's
Okay.
you're taking hydrogen atoms, bring them together fast enough so that they stick together, and you're creating helium. And there's a tiny little change in mass that you get going from two hydrogens to a helium, and that gets released ultimately as energy. Of course, there's a couple of steps to this process depending on how you do it.
Gotcha.
Different stars in the universe will harness this in slightly different ways or different cycles, but that's the idea. Now, stars are really great examples of this because they've worked this out since about 12 billion years ago.
Yeah. They're experts.
Yes, they are, and they're very stable because of how a concept called hydrostatic equilibrium works. It's basically a balance between gravity and pressure, and you can never overbalance one really until the star dies, basically. So if we could only build something like a star that would solve our problems, however, stars are big and kind of difficult to corral.
Well, yeah.
So we're trying to do the equivalent with, instead of a whole bunch of stars mass, we want to use like magnetic fields and more creative ways to do it. But the idea is you've got to get these particles moving fast enough so they stick. The only way to do that is if they're sufficiently hot. And to create that kind of heat, we're talking like tens of millions of Kelvin, and that's going to need a lot of energy input in getting it nice and particularly arranged in just the right way. And
Yeah.
if it sounds challenging, that's because it is, and
That's what it is.
That's
Right.
the problem.
Yeah, for some more context, like you were saying, in stars they have, obviously a lot of heat, but that's just in essence because of the amount of mass that they have and their sheer gravity that kind of holds it all together. But we don't have that mass and therefore that gravity on Earth. So we have to compensate essentially by making it more pressurized and hotter than a sun. So the nuclear fusion reactors that are being developed here on Earth, we can talk about ITER if we want to get into that, which is kind of like the leading example right now.
Sure.
But that's, if I remember this correctly, that's going to produce temperatures in its reactor that's 10 times hotter than the center of the sun. So it actually has to go much hotter than a star to compensate for not having the gravity.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's crazy. 10 times hotter?
That's a lot of energy put in for energy that you get out. And so far, the
Yeah.
equation doesn't work in our favor, but you can imagine like one day making it more self-sustaining and efficient. Like, okay, great, we can use this for a reliable source of energy.
And then that's clean, reliable energy for...
you get some helium out.
Yeah, right.
It's hot,
that's
but,
the thing.
you know,
the waste from nuclear fusion is mostly helium, which is a resource that we're kind of ironically running out
Yeah,
of.
we're going to need it anyway.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because
Really?
most of the helium.
My kid's got birthdays. Come on.
I was going to say, can I create a balloon business that just harvests the nuclear reaction helium and then sell it as
Right.
party
Isn't
balloons?
that an idea? A nuclear reactor, and then just like on the side, you just
Yes.
have a
There's
helium
just a
balloon
guy like
business.
filling up.
It'd be hilarious if it was just one guy. Yeah, there could be a whole no operation, no building.
Right.
It's just
Yeah.
kind of a guy in a clown costume, like filling up
Yeah.
the balloon, tying
Like one of
it.
those like Disney World.
yeah.
'Cause if I understand it correctly, I'm sure that I know the helium is also produced in stars and through some other like solar activity, but a lot of the helium on Earth is actually produced through radioactive decay of uranium and I guess thorium and these types of elements. So that basically means that helium itself is almost a non-renewable resource in the same way as fossil fuels. Like it does get produced very slowly over time in the same way that fossils will slowly turn to oil,
Yeah.
but at a rate that's way, way, way slower than we're using it today.
So we would run out of helium.
Oh yeah, that's always
hypothetically.
a danger. Yeah, in physics, we use helium all the time, mostly to keep things really cold.
Yeah.
And then play with helium when it's cold because that's physically interesting too. So we're always constantly running across supply chain issues with that.
Really?
Yeah.
So that could be a
100%.
you circumvent that problem.
I mean, that's the
With-
waste that it produces,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, I mean, that's
Useful
dope.
waste.
And
that's great.
As far as like fuel goes, it basically uses seawater as its fuel, which we do not have a lack of today. Not even like fresh water necessarily. Seawater is actually advantageous for a couple reasons, but so,
Because of the salt?
not because of the salt. It's because the a specific isotope that it uses for the nuclear reaction is just more prevalent in seawater for some reason.
Gotcha.
Than freshwater. I don't
Okay.
really understand the reasoning why.
Okay.
I think it's because seawater also includes a lot of uranium, just kind of naturally, and uranium slowly decays into this by impacting the molecules around it. But the premise is that it uses water for fuel, which is great. It's clean. It's renewable, essentially. I mean, not quite renewable because we are extracting a specific type of isotope from this. But it's so abundant here on Earth that, I mean, we're talking about, even in terms of exponential growth, we're probably talking at the very least thousands of years of fuel, if not millions, which is, insane. I mean, if we can go 1,000 years without having to worry about our energy source, that's a radical change since we started using anything other than wood, honestly.
Yeah. I don't, you ever see those historical pictures of like here to New England where it's like, this is 1800, there are no more trees because we cut them all down.
That was an article.
All the trees here are young because like we cut all the original ones down.
Yeah, if you look at Mount Washington, it used to just be just bland. There was nothing. It was just dirt. That's it.
Yeah.
And that was actually an article that you wrote about on your Substack, which was that there was a point where England was going to run out of trees, and then coal was discovered, and then they didn't have to worry about cutting down all the trees anymore. For
I mean,
fuel.
people had known about coal for probably a couple thousand years, especially in like China and Central Europe at this point. But almost ironically, people, even though they knew about coal, they really like intentionally didn't use it, and they just decided to chop down trees instead because it's a dirty fuel. It produces all this soot. It's just not that nice to be around, frankly.
Yeah.
So people just kind of preferred to chop down other forests instead of rely on coal until with England in about 1800, they had essentially chopped down every tree on the island, and it was this big empire. They needed to fuel it somehow, and they said, okay, fuck it, basically.
Yeah.
We'll use coal.
Yeah. It's just poor people breathing it in anyway, so we don't care about it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, they usually get thrown to the wayside with these.
And there is actually like a really funny history of the kind of like monarchy in England fighting with the commoners around this time about coal usage, because like the smoke would go up in there and like drift into like the castle windows, and they would get really angry. There's a great book just called Coal by Barbara Fries that talks about a lot of this that I highly recommend.
Let's do a bit of a small pivot here. What are your thoughts on the sort of idea of net zero? The plan, I think, currently in this country is like by 2050, we want to be at net zero carbon emissions. Is this a reasonable thing? Any critiques of this? Any thoughts?
In terms of like wanting to do it?
No, like, is it feasible? Can we do it? Is it possible?
Well, I mean, I can tell you with like the physical limitations of things, but I can't tell you that much about like whether we have the gumption to actually do it.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I mean, my opinion on it is essentially that with current technology, I don't think we'll make those targets. There's a lot of technical issues why these transitions are really hard. First of all, the energy grid is the biggest machine on the planet, if you want to think about that. I mean, we're talking about a multi-trillion-dollar machine, essentially. There's nothing, especially for like the U.S. or probably more realistically the Chinese power grid, there's nothing that even comes close to it in scale today. Not to mention that it goes between borders, and we already, especially in like Europe, have almost a globally interconnected grid, right? So the fact of the matter is just that it's a really big ship and it takes a while to turn. That's part of the crux of the problem. But also that, you mentioned solar, and I do critique solar a lot in the book. I do want to be clear that I think that these renewable energies have places in our world, and I think that they're important for our progress. But with current technology, there are very technical problems that you run into with the grid, with like stability. Like you're not producing power when like today in Pittsburgh, right?
That's always been my thought, is like, how do you make solar work here whenever right now it's gloomy, it's gray, it's raining right now?
And the reality is that it's very difficult, even on solar, in the types of solar that we use, photovoltaics, the most popular ones. we're even like already starting to approach the theoretical limits on efficiency in these panels. So like we may be able to marginally increase how productive they are, but we're already kind of reaching a point where the physics almost doesn't allow. I don't know how much you're familiar with this.
Yeah, I've been reading up more on that, and I'd say that's a pretty accurate description. I mean, the kind of add-ons that we're putting in now with thermoelectric cooling are pretty neat. I never thought about that before, but yeah, I think kind of like how I said before, it's like if we wanted to get everything from solar, we would just have to say goodbye to the state of Oregon.
Which I'd be totally okay with, by the way. I want
Carson
that to
hates
go. I
Portland,
want
everybody.
to go on the record.
Yeah.
If it meant just getting rid of North Dakota, would North Dakota do it?
That's probably about the same size.
Yeah.
But
I'd be okay with that.
That's so the problem though is like how do you get that energy other places? And if that one superconductor candidate from a couple months ago, if that held water, then we would be in just fine shape because then you can transfer that energy via electricity without any loss anywhere you'd want. But we can't do that. So kind of as you lay out here in the book, we need a strategic deployment of local sources of energy for particular communities in a smart grid sort of. I don't want to overuse smart grid because I feel like that's something that gets thrown around a lot without a lot of explanation. So it's like that's something that requires a ton of investment on the personal to governmental level. And it's not my place to say that we can or cannot do it. I'm just saying that most likely, I think I would agree that it's not feasible that we would meet those goals. Like from a personal level, like I've wanted to put solar panels on my house for a while now. But if I talk to someone from a solar company, you know, like I'll look at the numbers that they lay out. It's only cost effective if I'm there for 20 to 30 years. And like I can't make that guarantee.
Exactly.
And that's true for anyone else. So and it's just still ridiculously expensive, and there's not the financial impetus or, you know, like collective governmental action needed to bring down the cost for everyone to implement these widely needed changes.
Right.
So yes,
And
agree.
and I think you hit on something important there was that we need to think simultaneously. We need to think globally and very like hyper locally in terms of energy, because especially on the renewable front, so we're talking geothermal, solar, wind, hydro, the variations in your ability to generate these types of power varies massively, you know, orders of magnitude depend on your region. I talked about this in a Post-Gazette article as well.
You did, yeah.
In the sense that Pennsylvania is actually a great global example, in my opinion, of why renewables are inadequate at some points, because Pennsylvania has really, I mean, great fossil fuel reserves, right? We kind of like helped lead the country for a couple hundred years in our industrialization. But we have really terrible renewable resources, unfortunately. We don't have great wind.
Nope.
I mean, again, Pittsburgh especially.
We're in a valley.
Yeah.
Wind is like
Wind isn't great, but
not gonna
also
be
like
great.
solar in like the whole like Northeast isn't really that great. It's just not that like cost effective. But then hydro, I believe, I was reading a Department of Energy study that looked into Pennsylvania's hydro potential, and they calculated that if we pretty much dammed all of like the dammable rivers in Pennsylvania and tried to generate marginal electricity here and there, which is not to say that it would be cost effective anyways. I think they had estimated that we would be able to produce 600 megawatts of energy, which is like a small to medium sized coal plant. Like if we
and all the beavers would be very sad.
And they'd be very sad,
Yeah.
Yeah, they would be.
Yeah.
And we have no geothermal, right? So it's a great example of why we need some sort of other alternative.
Yeah. I used to live next to Niagara Falls, and it was just like, energy is free and cheap.
Right.
Yeah.
I going through kind of the here's what's going to work in different regions or not in your book with regards to these different energy sources. It's kind of like the how we're thinking about food now, right? It's like everything's very hyper local, but also thinking globally. I think it's very interesting that we're like kind of taking that approach with multiple problems, not just this one.
And I do want to say something. Earlier, I said that, I don't think that with current technology we'll reach these goals by 2050. I do think that could change. And I don't necessarily think that it will change, but I'm accepting that humans are really bad at thinking in experiments, including
Yeah.
myself.
I made my career on that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not good at it at all. I don't. Jeremiah texts me. He's like, think about this. He texts me all these numbers, and I'm like,
Like what last night, right?
Yeah,
I'll
yeah.
have to mention that.
Yeah, you will have
That's
to mention that.
we'll get
But
into it. But in the sense that there's so many developments happening today, whether it's like biotech or AI or maybe nuclear fusion coming up or quantum computing or whatever it is, or robotics.
Quantum computing is very energy expensive.
Is
right?
it?
Oh yeah, because everything's got to be cold.
Okay.
very
Yeah.
cold.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So that's a very.
Yeah.
But that's also I've in my brain, quantum computing is like magic. Every time people explain it to me, I'm like, this is indistinguishable from science. Like this is just it's like
Yeah.
the stuff they say we would be able to do with it is kind of nuts.
Yeah, and I have a healthy amount of skepticism with that because in order to harness the magic of quantum mechanics, having this kind of probabilistic indetermination of states, whatever quantum system you have, whether it's like spinning electrons or protons or what have you, it's like you need to keep that isolated, and it's very, very sensitive. In order to do that, you need a ton of energy to keep everything cold
Yeah.
and magnetically isolated. You need to be super careful, and we're just not at a point where the benefits outweigh the problems.
Yeah.
And I don't think we will be for quite some time. I mean, I know like Moore's law for classical computing is going to level off, but I just don't see quantum mechanics taking over, quantum computing taking over like within the decade.
Gotcha. But yeah, so there's just so many different developments happening around the world. I'm kind of an optimist, and I like to make some bold predictions. I'll be honest about that. I like to think about what could happen in a world where we, kind of come together and try. Carson harasses me about this.
So this is the thing. As Jeremiah says, if everyone on the planet just selflessly stopped everything for 10 years and focused entirely on we could solve all the problems.
Or we need a Manhattan Project for this.
Yeah, we would
That's
need.
what my wife always says. It's like, why can't we shove all the climate scientists into the desert somewhere and have them work on this?
Or is that what you said for a decade? You said if everyone just came together and worked.
I think
for
that's
a
what I said.
decade.
I was like, if everyone on the planet just did 80-hour weeks for a decade,
Yeah.
then we would live in a utopia.
Well, I feel like that's what we have to do anyway. So
Yeah.
80-hour weeks.
Because this thing about Jeremiah, Dr. Mullen, and I love Jeremiah to death, but in Jeremiah's brain, and I don't want to take away his optimism because I do need it, because I go into a doomer mode and Jeremiah's like, but think about it. In 10 years, we'll all be living to 200. And I'm like, well, that's crazy. But in Jeremiah's brain, the entire country is just him. So he's like, if we give all these people,
If everyone was me,
if we give all these people AI and we give them driverless cars, this will be. And I'm like, Jeremiah, I've walked outside in Pittsburgh. I've seen some craziness.
Right.
Yeah.
As you're saying it, I think that I would be the perfect communist citizen.
Yeah.
Yeah. You would be. Go over there. Help him figure it out.
Yeah, this kind of makes me think of, there's been a lot of attention to carbon capture. And in terms of like, okay, if we want to see something like this as a reality that's going to require collective sacrifice, it doesn't really enter the public consciousness as much what that would mean. I was doing some calculations with this. An industry, like especially coal, like they're like, oh, carbon capture, but that means we can get away with whatever we want. We just need to like invest in this technology, suck it out of the atmosphere. The problem is there's always a fundamental physical limitation to anything you want to do. And something like carbon capture, for instance, that's entropy. So you're basically it's like there's carbon dioxide in the air, we want to get it and compress it. You have to reverse entropy. And that is going to come at a significant energy cost. And so, I was working out the math to see what it would be. And if you wanted to scrub 1 part per million from our atmosphere, that's like $120 billion. And we want more than 1 part per million of CO2. We probably want like 50 to 100. To get it back to 350? Or something
Yeah,
like that?
probably.
Yeah.
Because historically speaking, the level has been around 200 in like pre-industrial levels. I think 240 is the often quoted number.
Parts per million of carbon
Yeah,
dioxide.
right.
So it's going to take
But-
trillions of dollars. We could just print it,
Well,
couldn't
if,
we? Can't
if
we
you're
just?
talking 120 billion, that's like the low limit without any process efficiencies. That's just to overcome entropy. Nothing is, you can't go anything under that limit. So if you factor in, okay, it's not going to be 100% efficient getting power to there. We're probably going to need solar. That's going to have all of its other things. So we're talking about like another factor of 5 to 10. So bump up the number to $1 trillion. That's just one part per million.
And what do you do with it once you've captured it? You bury it in the ground. You
Yeah.
blast it off into space.
Essentially. You can react it with other sorts of elements or chemicals, and it'll solidify into a solid.
Okay.
That's what is kind of like a very common method right now.
Yeah.
Or you literally do just kind of like drill a hole down into the ground, into some sort of cavern, and just pump it down there.
Yeah.
Mm.
And if you just want to relate this to like energy costs of how much we would need to get, like, it's a couple of % of our current energy use globally, which you may think like, okay, well, if we all cut back like 2 to 5%, that's fine. But if we keep going business as usual with emissions, in order to keep up with that increasing rate of carbon dioxide being put out into the air, that quickly scales up to about 50% or more of our energy. So it's like asking everyone in the world to give up 50% of how they use energy. So it's like bye-bye hot showers.
Right,
like,
exactly.
Goodbye podcasting.
Goodbye podcast.
This is not good.
Goodbye TikTok. Well, actually,
We can't do this. You cannot take away my podcasting. I won't let you. Okay, these are maybe some questions that are maybe a little bit more focused towards Jeremiah, but
That's okay.
obviously chime in.
I'll just take a nap.
I'll chime in as much as you can here. Jeremiah, this is always something we talked about this, but I want to discuss it for the people listening or watching. How do we balance out this sort of idea that we've got to take all of the existing industrialized countries, start moving them towards cleaner energy? How do we balance that out with the developing world that is now starting to ramp up their industrialization? Morally, how do we balance that out? In practice, how do we balance that out? What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of going to be the crux of the problem going forward in the next 30 to 70 years, I would say. Because it's true, the industrial world, especially, particularly the UK, France, US, Germany, China, Russia, and especially the US and China, we've really got the burden of like climate change at this moment, right? We've produced by far the most greenhouse gas emissions, not knowingly, admittedly, right? It was an accident for most of the time.
Well, I don't know. I think the physics of the greenhouse effect was known for a very long time.
It was, right, and that's true. And I talk about this in like the
Yeah.
intro to my book. Some people even kind of early on, what was it, like the 1850s, I want to say?
Arrhenius.
Yeah, Arrhenius, kind of one of the first people to fully write a paper explaining the greenhouse effect and its possibility, actively argued for climate change in order to, to like equalize the world or something like that. Because they had argued that, look, because you have to think about the time that they are in, right? They were in a time of, compared to today, like almost abject poverty in reality.
Yeah.
And the big concern still was, hey, I need to find enough food to eat.
Yep.
And they they suggested warming the planet so that more food could be grown in like Canada and Siberia, essentially.
Interesting.
Because, and it makes like logical sense on that front. Where they go wrong is that they hadn't considered the other external consequences, really.
Or if the soil was any good up there.
Or if the soil was any good, sure. But I'm forgetting your original question.
So how do we morally and in practice balance out that part of the developing world? Because to me it seems crazy to go and say, oh no, you can't do this. Net neutral. Whenever we spent the last how many hundreds of years just dumping CO2 into the atmosphere. I think
that it is crazy to say no, you can't. Bjorn Lomborg has talked a lot about this, and I really respect his opinion on this in the sense that a bigger problem than climate change is like global development in itself. I think that global development needs to kind of be the first thing. I mean, we still have 7 million people a year dying of air pollution, right? We have, and most of that is just from poor countries like China, India specifically, and in sub-Saharan Africa, where the countries don't have the money to afford cleaner systems, essentially. So there's air pollution, there's plastic pollution, all these sorts of things are really detrimental to the developing world. And the way to get out of it historically has been to, burn coal, burn gas, burn oil, so that you can get richer and develop your country. Now, I don't think that we need to incentivize burning fossil fuels for the reason that what we're interested in is not burning fossil fuels, we're interested in energy, right? So there's multiple different ways of getting this energy. What the developed world needs to do is help the developing world develop with clean energy. That's the key of it, right? So, I mean, frankly, I do believe that it may not be our responsibility. Some may argue that it would be our responsibility to help them because of how, like Europe especially kind of like messed up, colonized parts of the world.
Yeah.
There's an argument there. I'm not going to make that argument. I would make it in the sense that it's just, if we care about humans, it's what we should do for the world. Maybe you want to call it charity. I don't care what you call it, but there's people suffering needlessly, and just with like low interest loans, if we want to do it that way, we can help them develop, not just in a way that doesn't produce carbon emissions to the scale that we have historically, but also it's kind of like fundamentally better, right? We can help them develop cleaner, faster, cheaper.
Yeah, it's like if you can avoid a depressing, like Charles Dickensian sort of era of your own development, like
exactly.
Why wouldn't you?
Exactly, right. For billions of people. I mean, I believe it's Nigeria is going to become almost as populous as China by the end of this century. I mean,
That's nuts.
We're talking about adding several billion people just in sub-Saharan Africa, and the scale of this issue. I mean, that's what the U.S. and Europe combined is about 1.1, 1.2 billion people. We're talking about a huge amount of human beings here that are needlessly going to suffer going forward. That we could, if not stop that, we can alleviate that suffering by any marginal fraction that you can alleviate that. I mean, if you can reduce global deaths of air pollution by 1%, you're talking about what, I don't know, 700,000 people, 70,000 people a year.
Even if it was just 70,000, that's a lot of people.
And the scale is much bigger than that. In fact, in reality, we're talking about, especially over the course of decades, we're talking about quite literally probably tens of millions or hundreds of millions of lives that we can save from premature death and disease.
Yeah. Now, from what I've seen and kind of from what I've been told, corporations are kind of out of control in the area of like polluting the carbon emissions and stuff like that, because they're not, and I don't know exactly what it is, or that it's like they're allowed to get away with this stuff, but essentially I'm bringing up like the argument for a carbon tax. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the carbon tax is a very controversial policy that I would say I'm personally in favor of. There's a few different ways to do it, some which may be better than others. The premise is that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases have a effect on the world around them, right? And physically, this is true. The premise essentially is that say take a coal plant today. Coal plant costs money because you have your inputs, you have the coal, and you have the power to start burning the coal and all these things. We factor that into the cost of that electricity. What we do not now, since the 70s, we factored in things like air pollution. To an extent, I still think that it's probably underappreciated as a threat. But, this is why we started getting just like clean air regulations, clean water regulations, these kinds of things. Basically, a carbon tax premises that carbon dioxide should be regulated under air pollution controls because it has external impacts on the world around it in economic terms. So you can try to calculate how much any specific amount of carbon dioxide might impact the world. The EPA does these calculations. It's pretty complex. I won't claim to fully understand all of it. But again, the premise is just that, if 1 gram of carbon dioxide warms the planet by X amount, how many microcents, I guess, probably, will that, impact the economy through things like sea level rise, extra heating.
That's a very complex equation.
It's very, very complex.
I'm thinking of all the things that would go into it. I'm like,
we're talking.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Doing the actual calculation will also induce warming through.
yeah.
So then you have to factor you made me do this calculation for this, and so I have to throw in a couple extra microcents.
We're just in a circle.
Yeah.
It would just go on forever.
So that's the premise of where a carbon tax comes from. Just that, look, carbon dioxide has external effects, and we need to find a way to factor that into our economic system. And I agree with that because I think it's a failure of capitalism when we don't factor in external consequences, and that's how we get, frankly, like corporations allowed to pollute the world and allowed to hurt people in various ways.
They're like dumping chemicals into the water.
Yeah.
If a regular person did that, I think it's classified as like domestic terrorism, like poisoning a water supply is like a crazy crime, and they're just doing it. Anyway, so I want to talk about the Kuznets curve. Is that the name of it?
Yeah,
I get it right?
Kuznets. I don't actually know how to pronounce it because I've only ever seen it in writing, to be
That's
honest.
okay. But can you talk a little bit? Because I think this is an interesting part of the conversation.
This is something that I learned that really incentivized me to write the book because it totally reframed how I saw the world, especially environmental degradation. The Kuznets curve essentially is a chart. On the x-axis is, you can put it a few different ways. I prefer GDP.
Okay.
And on the y-axis is environmental damage. And it's a parabolic curve. So essentially, it means that as we grow in wealth, our impact on the environment increases. And I think this is probably true. There's a few caveats to it in the sense that, maybe we're hurting the environment more today, not because we're richer, but because we have more people. I think it's probably both.
Can you describe the parabola shape a little bit more?
Yeah, so it's like a upside down U shape, right? So it basically means that I guess I'll go this way for the camera. It basically means that at the start of time, I guess, everyone was very poor and we had minimal environmental impact, right? Almost none.
Yeah, we had no capability to.
Yeah, we're talking like hunter-gatherer tribes here, right? But let's say agriculture hits, all these things develop, technology, civilization, etc. And we start getting richer and our quality goes up. And as we get richer, we also begin to hurt the environment more, right? What the Kuznets curve posits is that as we continue to get richer, our environmental impact will not continue to go up, but instead will hit a tipping point and it'll come back down to a point where we actually have very little or maybe no environmental impact.
Is that globally or is that done by country to country?
It's more of a theory than anything, but you can see it in specific country examples.
So I'm thinking of like Norway that historically has and currently has been getting very wealthy through oil. So they export it all to get very wealthy, and they're externalizing that environmental degradation. So does that factor into this curve?
Yeah, externalizations or like offsets is definitely like a good point. And I think that's something that's been failed to be factored into these calculations before. I wouldn't necessarily know enough about Norway. Obviously, they're like a huge oil exporter in the world, and they've gotten insanely rich off of it. I would look at it in terms of it, like just conceptually. If we look at it globally, I would look at it in terms of like technological advancements. Like fundamentally today, the forms of energy, even the dirty forms of energy that we use today, are much cleaner than they were 100 years ago, right? Even the coal we burn is much more regulated than and just emits less than it was. But also just in the sense that as you get richer, we develop better solutions. And I think we're also trying to improve at the margins at this point, right? Like human life expectancy largely has kind of like hit a peak. We're kind of like reaching the biological limits on how long people actually can live at this point, even in like relatively poorer countries. So, I think about it in terms of like, we've become so rich that now we're developing nuclear or solar or wind power, or we're finding innovative ways to reduce plastic waste. We talked about England's kind of, tree crisis that they had, deforestation crisis that they had. I think that's a fair example, although not perfect, in the sense that, an environmental catastrophe actually kind of spurred on the Industrial Revolution in a sense. And I think it's an interesting way in the sense that, deforestation is actually a great example because we were really good at chopping down trees. I mean,
we are really good at cutting
we
things
mastered
down,
that one for sure. We got all the badges in there. So, in that sense, coal has its own environmental impact. So you could, if you really want to think about it realistically, it's probably multiple overlapping Kuznets curves.
Kind of reminds me of the Hubbard's curve, the way you're describing it.
I don't know what that is.
So there's a Hubbard's peak predicted in the 70s for U.S. oil production, and it basically follows the same, more of like a bell curve sort of shape, where it's like, this is just extraction, right? So it's like there is a certain amount in the ground somewhere. It starts really easy to get out, and then it gets really difficult. So the cost of extraction rises, and it kind of works its way out so that, there's a peak in production of whatever non-renewable resource you want. So Hubbard made waves in the 70s for predicting that actually I think it was in the 50s, making predictions for the 70s, that U.S. production would stall out in the 70s, and it did. And then worldwide, he predicted oil production would peak in around 2000 and then start to decline. And I remember seeing a lot of doomsday folks saying that, like, we're going to hit peak oil, and then there's not going to be any oil, but everything else in our world is optimized for the consumption of oil. So there's
Dr. Mullen, can you move a little close to
all hell is going to break loose. And the funny thing though is that although the U.S. production went down and worldwide it went down, it actually started to go up again as technology improved. And I saw this in a Physics Today article. There was the original Hubbard's peak, and then there was a little screw you, we figured it out, which is like ultimately bad because all of this book.
Yeah.
So, but it just mathematically sounds very similar.
Yeah, it does sound pretty similar.
Except like degradation, you want it to go down, so it's
right.
I hadn't thought about that. If you export all of your environmental degradation, then it wouldn't necessarily factor into your country if you're shipping everything
Right.
out.
And it's a big issue, and that's why I prefer to look at these issues for one reason, from a global perspective. Also, just because, especially in terms of like greenhouse gases, it is just better to look at it globally because it impacts everything globally.
Yeah.
CO2 doesn't care about borders.
Yeah. Well, I mean, ultimately, what we're looking at is just I hate to like overbeat this drum of like the failure of capitalism, but especially in the last 50 years or so, just to give it an arbitrary number. I mean, like capitalism is focused on the wealth gains of shareholders measured within the fiscal quarter. If that's what you're caring about, you're not going to worry about environmental concerns that can't be measured over that time frame.
Yeah.
So it's just like it's all within that theme of capitalism versus like long-term stewardship of our planet.
Right. I think as far as the incentives that they've that most corporations or capitalists have set for themselves, they've done a really great job of just
we met our own standards, which are garbage, but we met them. Yeah.
But the incentives are wrong, right?
Yeah.
That's the problem. We need to change how we're looking at the world and change what we're trying to achieve. This is another reason why I think that a better indicator than like GDP for growth is like quality of life indicators, just because that focuses more on like the people and how we're actually being impacted instead of just like, ooh, money, 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 you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I've said like
You mentioned this somewhere in the page 97 area. I noted it. You said like things tend to work out best when the government or some collective entity tries it first, when not, governed by a for-profit motive, and then industry develops. Right. I think the worry that I have now is that we're so private industry focused now. Even when it comes to space exploration, it's all just like, oh, all these industries are trying to assuage their CEOs' egos, but it's still motivated by profit. It's not motivated by like making the world gooder.
Sure.
So I'm deeply concerned.
Yeah, I've always, that's the thing I've recently been thinking about. Like, I think on paper, I like capitalism. I like the idea of like filling a gap in the market and giving people a good product. But this whole corporate capitalism thing, it doesn't seem to be working for really anyone other than the shareholders.
Yeah, if you care that our growth rate is 2 to 2.5% per year, if that's the only thing you care about, because that's the time frame you care about, a yearly time frame, we are not going to do well on this planet for very long.
It's very short-sighted.
Yeah.
It's very short-sighted. All right, well, Dr. Mullen, this is mainly a thing for Jeremiah because he loves these topics I'm about to talk about.
I don't mean to butt in so much.
No. That's why you're here. That's why we're here. No, this is so that. So Jeremiah's been trying to convince me to eat lab-grown meat. He's been trying to do this for a very long time. He's saying that it's going to be environmentally more friendly, which I don't disagree with. But Jeremiah, go ahead. Try to sell me on this lab-grown meat
cricket
stuff.
tacos. I'm telling you, cricket taco truck.
No, I'm not eating
I
crickets.
mean, what do you want me to say? I think that maybe I should explain what
Sure, yeah, like explain the concept. Yeah, maybe I teed it off terribly, but explain for people that haven't really known, explain this concept of like this is going to be a thing that we're going to be eating lab-grown steak burgers.
I will say I'm going to stop using the word lab-grown because I realize that it makes people feel all icky inside.
It makes me feel icky.
I'm going to start using the term cultivated meat personally.
Ooh. Oh, okay.
That's good. And then call the other stuff like mass-produced sludge burgers. Industrial sludge burger.
Industrial sludge burger.
I mean, here's the premise, right? Why would we raise a whole cow for a burger when we could just grow the burger with the cow's cells? That's the premise of cultivated meat, is that you take muscle cells, which muscle forms meat, right? And you kind of give it all the nutrients and energy that it requires to duplicate, but there's no brain behind it. And it just kind of does its thing. And when your burger has grown, you extract it. And
you extract the burgers are ripe finally. Let's go pick the burgers. It'll be like we're picking vegetables.
yeah, I mean, that's like the TLDR version of it.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that, Dr. Mullen?
I'm
heard about this?
all for it for so many reasons. Like, one, environmentally, I forget the percentage of emissions that come from industrial agriculture.
It's about a quarter of all
yeah,
emissions.
I mean, that alone is a solid enough argument. Plus the humanitarian argument. Like, I'm not going to get into animal rights and all of that, but the more I think about it, the more uncomfortable.
Jeremiah will if you don't.
Yeah, I mean,
watch out.
have you ever
deep into this?
Cows are cute. Chickens I don't care about because they're stupid, but cows are cute. But yeah, I mean, it's certainly just from the energy standpoint. Plus, I mean, if you have a chance that every steak you have for the rest of your life is going to be like at least the same quality as the best steak you've ever had before.
That's a good point. The quality could be higher.
Quality is important because it is almost because you have more oversight over it than an animal. I mean, an animal, if you really think about it, sure, we can lock it in a cage, but past the skin wall, we have no control really over what's going on at all. I like to frame this for cultivated meat in the sense that if we look at chickens today, you can't eat raw chicken because there's so much contamination with like salmonella and everything, which is not inherent to chickens, but it's a bacteria that gets infested in chicken farms.
Yeah.
But with lab-grown meat, you wouldn't have any infection in
cultivated meat.
Cultivated meat, Jeremiah. You have to get the language right.
Yeah.
It makes me feel.
Oh,
icky
that's the problem.
inside.
We're not media marketing people.
Oh
That's the
man,
issue.
yeah.
You need to go to Point Park and be like, "Hey, we have this lab-grown meat campaign. You guys got to fix this up for us."
Yeah.
Go to the School of Business; they'll sort you out.
But so with cultivated meat, you won't necessarily have contamination. So you could eat theoretically raw chicken. I also should say, like, you aren't limited by reality in the same sense that you are. If you have the genetic code, theoretically, you can grow whatever meat you want. I mean, we could live in a world, I don't necessarily know that we will, where you may be able to eat a mammoth steak or something like that.
Yeah, and I have the best counter
narwhal,
argument,
please.
Yeah, I mean that's what I'm saying is like, well, first of all, woolly mammoth. There's no way it's tasty. You'd have to braise it for a month to make it. It's probably
I bet
so
down
tough.
to the Creation Museum in Kentucky, that's probably a thing that they could do. Be like, eat all the animals off of Noah's.
Yes. Oh, that could be great. That could be great. Could we now? This might be a bit of a stretch.
That's what God wants you to do.
Exactly. Here's a bit of a stretch. Could the Natural History Museum start selling dinosaur meat? Can we get some?
Probably not dinosaurs. I don't think we have dinosaur DNA.
We don't have any DNA.
Just make it like a sloppy turkey. It'd be fine.
Yeah, I was gonna say but you don't. You just
really gamey
market it
turkey.
as such.
I mean,
Actually, you know what? Use the wild turkeys that are like overrunning this town.
Yes.
Solve those two problems at
what's
once.
up with the deer in Pittsburgh? Can we bow hunt in the city now? Is that what I heard? Have you heard
What?
about this?
Oh,
Bow hunting in the city?
well, I already
We're-
worked downtown,
I think
so I
in,
never
like,
felt
parks.
safe.
We're veering off track. Yeah, I mean,
And probably not like downtown, but in like parks up by like Pitt where I'm at. Yeah, they like legalized bow hunting in the parks.
so we could be playing disc golf at Shenley, and an arrow just comes by and hits you
Yeah.
right in the face.
That's
Yeah, just don't
Terrifying.
Don't wear anything that's kind of furry, I guess, or brown.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the furries can't go up there anymore. It's a real problem.
that's okay with me.
It's a real.
What is this podcast
Oh my
about?
gosh,
Anyway,
we're getting canceled actively. Point Park's on their way. Okay, so that's the first one. Is that Jeremiah's been talking about lab-grown meat. The
Yeah.
second one is now this one I'm totally on board with vertical farming. I just want you to talk about it because I think this is just cool and the people should hear about it.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
vertical farming's cool.
vertical farming and cultivated meat. I think it's important. Well, I guess I'll explain vertical farming. Basically, the premise of vertical farming is that for all of human history since the dawn of agriculture, we've grown our food in 2 dimensions because you need the third dimension, verticality, for sunlight to hit your crops so that they can grow and feed off the sun, photosynthesis. But we've reached a point in our technological abilities today where we don't even need sunlight to grow crops. We can emulate sunlight through like LED lighting artificially. So the question is kind of begged, like, why are we still only growing our food in 2 dimensions, right? So basically, if you have a tray of lettuce, you can above that put a set of lights that emulate sunlight, or even there's actually like even better ways of growing crops than just natural sunlight as well. So there's actually more efficient ways than just naturally, ironically. And then over top of that lighting, you have another tray of lettuce, and then more lighting and more lettuce, and so on, right? What this means by adding another whole dimension to your farming is that we can probably increase our productivity for this reason and a lot of others involved with vertical farming. For example, just that it is a more regulated environment than outside. I mean, we can probably, from the numbers that I've seen, increase productivity on any given land plot by like 100-fold with this. And it's great because you can grow food hyper locally as well. I think that's like a hugely beneficial point to it. There's this big issue of food deserts today, especially in like inner cities.
Yeah.
People get this wrong all the time. They think that people are like starving in cities. That's not at all what's happening. It's malnutrition.
It's not literally a food desert. It's that I go to the Dollar General across the street from my apartment, and it's all junk.
Exactly.
There's nothing good
There's nothing
and nutritious to
nutritious.
buy. It
Exactly.
doesn't exist. It's crazy.
But so
Yeah.
we could very realistically start growing fresh, clean produce with I should also say like less pesticides, right? Less herbicides, all these things.
Imagine cutting down the transportation. costs
Exactly.
and energy
Transportation
that, too.
alone is a huge factor.
Everything's in season all year round.
Everything is in season all year round, fresh produce, where it needs to be eaten. I mean, I think that's so obviously fundamentally better than our current system that I do think it's one of those things that we could do it and we should do it. I don't necessarily know that we will, because there's this huge industry that's already pushing against this and cultivated meat, like the big ag, essentially. Which
Big
is
crops.
big crops, yeah.
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 Wow. Well, I love that. And then
Big Twix too.
Big Twix. Yeah, Big Twix
For
is a
sure.
real problem.
It's a good point.
And then he loves self-driving cars. I do not like self-driving cars at all. But you love self-driving cars.
I think they're pretty cool, yeah. I mean,
they're cool. I just don't want to get in one.
Almost certainly the most dangerous thing you do on any given day is drive your car,
That I agree with.
right? If you could reduce your chances of being killed or maimed in a car crash by a factor of 100 or even 2, right? That's, I mean, we're talking about, I don't know what the numbers are in car crash deaths in the U.S., but certainly probably tens of thousands a year.
Oh, I think I actually do know this, funnily enough, because one of my friends did a news package
Oh,
for one
really?
of my classes. Yeah, I
Okay,
think it's
so what-
40,000
40,000.
a year in the United States. Or like last year, 40,000 people died from car
Yeah,
accidents.
and also not to mention, like, so I've like a short funny story. A few months ago, out front of my house, I just live on this like kind of calm street. It's like in front of an elementary school. Nothing like
Yeah.
crazy going on. This car had, I don't know, flipped itself out front of my house and crashed. Literally landed like on its hood,
Wow.
right out front of my doorstep, like pretty much
Wow.
right on my front porch. I don't know.
Like a turtle.
And
Yeah.
totaled your girlfriend's car.
Yeah,
Wow.
hit my girlfriend's car, totaled it. So I'm just thinking in the
And
sense
flipped
that,
it over. How did I've been on that, right? I picked you up. I don't understand how. I've picked him up. I don't understand how you flip your. I genuinely don't understand how you could do it. You'd have to be going so fast. But then again, it's like, what did they hit?
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Because even if you were going fast, you could
That's-
just go right through there.
It's like a Brockheimer film sort of maneuver.
No, I mean genuinely,
And
it's
and
this
it does get
person's a
crazier than
magic
that,
trick.
Because their car didn't even hit my girlfriend's car. Someone else that was presumably dodging them hit my girlfriend's car, and then that person then proceeded to run away from the scene.
Like got out of the car and ran.
Yeah, it's like an SNL skit. Like none of it makes sense at all. We haven't figured it out on our end, but I was just saying that because
This is not a problem of the future.
yeah, I mean like the kind of like mental baggage that comes with owning a car, and I can say like personally, I've had the worst car luck of any human being alive. I swear. In 2020, I had 3 different cars, for example, because it was ridiculous. But seriously, like the mental baggage and the wallet baggage. That
Yeah, the
comes-
financial
yeah,
burden
that
of having a
comes
car.
with
Cars are
having
not
a
cheap.
car it's really tremendous, in fact. And it messes people up. You know, when you have to miss work for a day to go find a new car because your car got totaled by some like jerk who hit it. for
Who
some
flipped
reason. Yeah,
their car
exactly,
onto
right.
yours on a quiet street in Oakland.
I mean, like factor that in with what is it? Like most Americans live, they have like $500-600 extra in their bank account, something like that.
Yeah.
No, it's most Americans couldn't cover an unexpected $500 expense.
Is that what it is?
That's it's like the majority of them. It's insane.
So like genuinely,
That's stressful.
yeah, I mean,
It is very
missing
stressful.
one day of work is like extremely stressful. There's a lot of really underappreciated ways that I think, even if it's not full self-driving cars, just like having cars that can automatically prevent incidents,
Now that I'm cool with.
hugely beneficial.
If I can drive my car, but if I mess up, the car can
Like,
stop.
take over?
Yeah, take over. I'm actually okay with.
And we're already seeing a lot of that today
Yeah.
in cars.
Yeah. Now, on the topic of, well, so, no, and those cars would be electric, most likely. That would be the ideal
prefer them to be
situation.
electric.
Yeah, but you got to be careful though. I remember one student who took one of my classes said like, "Oh, your class was so great and meaningful. I bought a hybrid car or an electric car or something like that." Because in one of my classes we do talk about a lot of environmental issues, and I was like, "Oh, that's great. That's lovely." Then I thought about it. I'm like, "Well, if you live here and you plug in your car, where does your electricity come from?" Well, probably fossil fuels.
Right.
Right.
This
So
Probably.
it's like that
Yeah.
doesn't actually help.
Yeah.
So
This is a point that I would love to elaborate on more. I'm probably going to write a Substack article on this exact topic sometime in the next coming months. I believe this to be one of the greatest misconceptions of our time. And here's the reason why. It is offsetting the emissions, like factually, especially in Pittsburgh, where I don't actually know what the energy mix is like where we live. I don't know if you have like any insight on that. It's mostly natural gas.
Yeah.
I'm certain that it's probably the vast
Yeah,
majority.
I can tell you how my house works, and it's a natural gas boiler.
Right.
And then, like, all the homes that are built in the 30s probably have that.
Yeah.
In my neighborhood.
I would wager that our energy demand is probably 90% gas and oil right now. But there's a really important point here, I think, in that there's a fundamental efficiency problem that's underappreciated. Internal combustion engines are crazy inefficient. That hence why they get so hot and why you can like you can cook an egg on the hood of some cars,
Yeah.
right?
Which
when
is
they're running.
fire, by the
Heat-
way. I do
heat
kind of like
engines
that.
are very inefficient.
Yeah,
There's a fundamental limit of efficiency that they have, and it's
Right.
just kind of like
But electric motors are very efficient. I mean, 95% efficient in some cases I've seen. So I've run this math multiple times myself and read papers on this because I find it so unbelievable, but it's true every time that I've checked into it, that if you, I want to make sure that I've used my words correctly here.
Okay.
If you, I'm losing my train of thought as well.
Should I open an old-timey restaurant where all of the eggs are cooked on the hoods of muscle cars with internal combustion engines? Should that happen?
I don't know that would be helpful.
Yes or yes?
But
Anyway.
okay, the premise is basically that if you use an electric car
Yeah.
and the same amount of energy that's required or the same, let's say, distance required to go an electric car, even if that car is powered entirely by coal, the probably dirtiest of all the fossil fuels, your carbon emissions and air pollution emissions are still less than just running a regular gas car because of an efficiency problem. And because electric cars are so much more efficient than gas cars, like even if you're using a power plant powered by oil versus a car powered by oil, gasoline. I guess gasoline is probably the more specific example here. It's still more efficient to just defer the emissions to the power plant, not only because the car is more efficient, but also the power plant is more efficient than an engine, right? Power plants get like around 40%, 45% efficiency in a lot of cases. That's still in itself double than what internal combustion engine has.
Right.
A lot.
So I don't feel so bad anymore now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and that's totally ignoring the fact that, especially in like the U.S., a lot of our electricity is not entirely like coal based, right? Like even if you have 30% clean energy in the U.S., actually our electricity here is probably a good amount nuclear. I hadn't considered that. So at each step, you're
Yeah.
reducing those emissions. Not to mention that you can change the power grid kind of collectively. You can change what sources you're using to input into the electricity. Whereas with an engine, you're not going to turn a combustion engine into a clean device in any, never. I mean, unless you use hydrogen or not even natural gas, biofuels, I guess, maybe. But those are all a stretch.
So I have a
Yeah.
question for you then. So when I found this when I first moved down to Pennsylvania, I was very confused about how you obtain electricity here. Because, if you have like natural gas appliances and heat, that's one thing. But
Can you guys get this a little
need
closer to the mic?
you need electricity too.
Yeah.
And so when I came down here, it's like, oh, you can purchase from any one of these providers, and now some of them offer renewable energy certificates. So it's like they claim you're getting it from solar or wind or something. What are your thoughts on?
I would love to talk about this.
Okay.
Renewable energy certificates are the single biggest scam in the world, in like the electricity world today. Basically, what they purport to do is, hey, if you pay us, like 1 cent per kilowatt hour more,
Yeah.
we can guarantee that you'll get all of your power from solar or wind or something
Right.
like that. That is just like flat out a lie. I have been anxiously waiting for like lawsuits to go over this genuinely, because you cannot guarantee that in any way. what they are doing in reality is that they can use the extra funds that you give them to incorporate more solar or wind into their electricity generation, which can feed into the grid. But you cannot guarantee that any
you
given
yourself are
electron
getting-
will go from a solar plant will come to you, because it all goes into a collective feed.
Okay.
The coal plant and the wind farm and the nuclear plant all feed into the same power grid, and you can't distinguish between their, probably quadrillions of electrons, I'd have to guess.
So it's more of like, at best case, it's like a charitable contribution,
Basically,
maybe?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. It's basically like, okay, I'm going to pay the fee to incentivize you and encourage you and help you incorporate more clean energy into your grid. In that sense, it's fine, but I do think that it's
Like the marketing has been
the marketing
misleading.
is misleading, yeah, because you can't generate like electron per electron, basically.
Yeah.
That you're actually getting clean
It's
energy.
like, I'll take this one and that one.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Okay,
that's
so
it.
It's a
when-
big pet peeve of mine.
Yeah, so when you see the like Inspire Energy guys and Giant Eagle, you're like,
Yeah.
liars.
I can agree, yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
And
because
this
like
all-
they knock on my door all the time.
Right.
And at some point I went with one of them because like I knew it wasn't exactly what they were describing, but I was like, well, this is a cause that like I'm for, so I'll
And
pay a
I
little
heard about
extra.
this for the first time maybe in like 2019, 2018, I'm going to
Uh-huh.
say. And that was kind of around the time when I was beginning to write this book.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard about it because a friend, I was over at his house and he was like looking through his mail and he was like, oh, I got this thing. Like, oh, they're going to, give me like all from wind power. That's kind of cool. And I was like, how the hell would that work?
No.
Yeah.
Basically my thought. I was like, that doesn't make
It's
any
like
sense.
because that's like Oklahoma somewhere.
Right,
Like
'cause,
how are
like,
you getting?
My thought was like, oh, are they gonna like rewire you to like a wind farm? Like,
Well,
are they gonna redo all of your?
This
all-
actually this makes me think of another thing we need to touch base on. I remember Tesla set up shop in Home Depot once, or Lowe's or whatever, and they're trying to sell you solar panels, which was good, but it was attached to this giant battery that they want to stick in your basement, and that was their solution at the time for a
How big?
persistent problem that we should discuss, and that's the energy storage problem.
Yes.
So instead of like figuring out a clever way to feed back into the grid at that time, this is probably about 10 years ago, they're like, here's this giant capacitor basically that's going to sit in your basement that at the intermittent times will have to discharge to give you the information you need. So I was thinking about that in terms of energy storage. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, energy storage is kind of like there's storage and transmission. These are the two big issues that if we could really solve them, we could actually incorporate a lot more renewable energy onto the grid.
We thought we were getting so close with that superconductor,
Yeah. Well,
quote unquote. Yeah.
we could get into that a bit later
Yeah.
too, if we want. But yeah, I mean, as far as Tesla goes, like their power walls, I think is what you're talking about here. I do think that their technology has gone pretty good at it over the past few years, but fundamentally, kind of the types of batteries that we use for energy storage. I mean, it's a lithium-ion battery, right? So it's the same type battery that's in your phone right now. Look, they're great, but they're terrible for energy storage or on like a societal scale, right?
Yeah.
I know I quote this in the book, and I'm going to get the numbers wrong here, but there was a study done by this admittedly like very pro-nuclear environmental organization, so take it with like a grain of salt. And they had basically tried to calculate, okay, if we took every battery in the state of California, so that's like phone batteries, car batteries, whatever, TV batteries, whatever it is. I don't know how you do these calculations, frankly. And let's see how long all the batteries in the entire state could power the electric grid as a whole, okay? And they had found that if you charge them all up, they could power it for like an hour or something like that, right?
That's not great.
Like an incredibly low amount. And if we're talking battery storage, for it to be realistic, we need to be able to store enough energy to power a society, not just for like a few minutes or like a few hours, but days, possibly weeks. I think about this. I have this concern that I've never heard anybody address before.
Is it coronal mass ejections or solar flares?
Well, that's a whole nother thing
All right.
too. But I was going to talk about like with solar power in a world where we nuke Kansas, flatten it out, and turn it all into solar farms. Right?
Which I'm also in. I mean, all of this. Like,
It's
take
already
whatever,
pretty flat.
whatever state you
It
want.
is true, it is all
I'm in
pretty-
favor of all this. Take a state, flatten it.
But,
you gotta
but if
do.
we do that, like, what happens when a volcano erupts, right? If we power the whole world from solar,
Well, at least we'll have the aerosols needed to cool down a
That's
little
true.
bit. Right?
that's true. But like, what happens when there's just a drop because of some sort of event or weather change where you don't really get enough solar power for like weeks or possibly months on end? That's from like a civilizational perspective, that's a real concern.
Of course.
If we're talking about like a volcanic eruption, which are threats on their own, obviously, but
You have to
yeah.
diversify your energy portfolio. It's
You have
kinda
to,
like
and this is why
investing.
diversification is important. You never want to put all your eggs in one basket. Not nuclear, not wind,
Yeah.
not solar.
Same thing with occupancy of worlds too.
Exactly.
Well, I don't like-
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I don't like wind power at all because Donald Trump told me it kills all the birds. Said you go by these wind fields, they kill all the birds.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, I'm out of here then. I don't want to kill
Another
birds.
one of the great misconceptions of energy that I tried to highlight in the book.
Very fun. Okay, well, let's continue on the battery thing.
Yeah,
We got a lot of slave labor getting these metals for us.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
not great.
That's the part of the problem with solar too, or anything else like that.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, same thing with everything that in your phone. You got to have tiny hands to assemble it too.
Yeah, same thing with pretty much every product that
Yeah.
I've purchased, including all of these. Everything we're using to record today was probably there's probably slave labor at some point
Yeah.
along the process,
I
which is
mean,
not fun.
Depending on what time it is right now, I might have this article out right now.
Yeah.
If it is noon, so I just had a Substack article dropped 11 minutes ago, I guess.
Just dropped. Go check
which
it out.
actually
Yeah.
talks a little bit about like how energy has impacted the history of slavery and these kinds of things. It's an interesting idea. I don't necessarily know that I have like completely infallible arguments, but it's something
Sure.
interesting to raise. I think.
Sure.
On terms of these resources that we're using for slave labor today, I mean, first, my understanding is that a lot of slave labor is actually like sex slavery. I would like some numbers on this. And any number on this is not gonna
Obviously
necessarily-
too high.
Well, obviously
Yeah.
too high. Also, probably underreported.
Yeah, that's possible.
Certainly underreported.
Yeah.
But it's just like difficult to estimate anything that's like a black market.
Yeah.
But on these batteries specifically, there is a very real issue on resources that we're using, especially like cobalt.
Cobalt is a
obviously,
big one.
the notorious one. But it's not just cobalt. It's also like lithium. It's also just
Yeah.
iron. It's diamonds. It's sapphires, emeralds,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
Asteroid mining, man. Didn't we talk about
We're
that?
going to get about that later on in the
Alright.
program.
We
We're
gotta
going to
talk
get to
about
that.
Yeah. Okay.
We'll get to asteroid mining.
But I do think that one way, and this goes way back into the very beginning of the conversation when I was saying that with current technology, I don't think that we will solve carbon by 2050. With new technologies, we might, and one of those new technologies might solve that and this issue at the same time, which would be like solid state batteries. If we can get
Yeah.
those to work, they might use totally different chemical formulas that rely on materials that are not quite as rare as cobalt. I do know that there's like some physical reasons why these elements are so useful because of their electron shells and everything makes them like incredibly useful for batteries. But there are other alternatives. I know like lithium ion phosphate is becoming popular right now. That could be an alternative type of battery. So there are just a bunch of different chemistries that can be played with, and I think they just need to, just test them thoroughly and let's try to find a good way.
Yeah. If I may kind of weigh in here about,
Of course.
now that we're talking about digital electronics, what springs to my mind is, I know this is going to be kind of an old reference, but about 20 years ago, a phrase kind of entered this sphere that of physics that I find myself in. It's the 1.7 kilogram microchip, which is short for that a standard at the time microchip that could fit on your fingernail cost about 1.7 kilograms of fossil fuels, and on top of that you needed 72 grams of refined chemicals, and that's ignoring the water use in putting this thing together.
And there's a lot of water.
Yeah,
use.
that's a lot
It's
of
very
water.
heavy.
And that's a mass ratio of use a processing use to final product of 630 to 1. Compare that to what's kind of more standard in manufacturing, and that's 2 to 1. So
Today.
yeah.
So it's gone down
And
by
this, no. 2 to 1 is like manufacturing
Like steel.
steel,
Oh, okay,
plastic,
okay.
whatever, like junk you want to get from Amazon. You know?
Okay.
You're basically saying that microchips are an incredibly energy-intensive process.
Yes, basically. And that was 20 years ago. Think about how much more that would be now with how transistor dense these things are. It's a simple application of considering the entropy involved. There's so much high localized order here. It comes at the expense of greater disorder elsewhere. So we're seeing that in carbon emissions.
Mm-hmm.
That's an example of increased entropy. We're seeing that with pollution, because that's like pollutants in the water you can't get back without additional expenditure of energy. And then what do we use these things for? I'm searching Google, well, increasingly DuckDuckGo now.
Yeah, I use DuckDuckGo.
I use DuckDuckGo as well.
Yeah. And if you actually look up how much energy does a standard Google search use, it's hard to compare to like something like a light bulb because there's so many different types of light bulbs now.
Yeah.
But the energy use is equivalent to about one light bulb for, and it's going to be kind of a broad range here. I'm going to quote it at like 10 to 20, maybe 30 minutes, depending on the light bulb. So
One Google search.
yeah, that's one Google search. Because
Brother.
like all these things, like same thing with when people talk about the cloud, like it's not magic. There's no like gray cartoonish cloud hanging over your head sending you electrons.
Yeah.
It's someone else's computer. And so you need energy to make these computers work and send that information to you. And a Google search, a pretty standard thing, is just one example.
Yeah.
Right? And then like when I'm riding the bus, I see people on TikTok all the time. And I'm just thinking of like, what is the energy impact and environmental impact on all this like stupid crap that we use our technology?
I mean, if you look on TikTok, TikTok at this point might just be mental illness. That might just be the bulk of TikTok content. It's just people, I don't even know what they're doing anymore.
Yeah.
They're just
Don't
like
use TikTok.
flailing about on a camera.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's
Love
like
me.
yeah, and I'm just like, what are you people? And yes, I doom scroll on YouTube Shorts. What are you gonna do?
As we flail around on the camera.
Yeah. As I do the exact same thing. Yeah, I'm the biggest hypocrite anyone's ever
But you're
seen.
not like doing silly dances. And
No, I'm not doing silly dances. I am.
And that's the thing that we were talking about when we were walking over. It's if you look at the energy consumption of, say, standard cloud computing, if you want to think of it that way, it's like, just going to give you a rough number here. Data centers for that, like 5 times 10 to the 10 watts or so. Compare that to our kind of 2 times 10 to the 13 watts. So, it's a 1,000th of it, but that's growing at a rate of 40% per year. And that's just the electrical energy consumed or used, I should say more properly, by those centers. And they're out of sight, out of mind.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I worry about. Like, there's
literally under
think of
the
the
sea
water that's
in
used to
some
cool
places.
those things,
Yeah.
And, that's set, if you think about it, like our standard kind of energy growth rate historically is somewhere in the 2 to 2.5% per year, which sounds small, but exponential growth catches up to you sooner rather than later. This is 40%. And that's going to outstrip our current our current energy consumption within like 18 to 20 years.
That's it.
We're talking about software eating the planet and having an enormous environmental impact that we're not even looking at.
Yeah, software literally just consuming the whole thing. I want to quickly get back to the batteries, and then we're going to do a bit of a pivot again. It's okay.
I hit on something that
You brought notes. I appreciate this.
I think it's a really important point.
Yeah, but let's get back to...
I never bring notes. I just waffle the whole time. And that's kind of how I live my life now. So I'm glad you brought notes.
I've really been a fan of the word waffle lately.
It's fun. It's the British slang word for like bullshitting. They call it waffling. And I just think it's funny. Like, I'm just waffling. It's fun. I don't know why I say it, but
Probably
it's
TikTok videos that you can find right now.
It might be. So we've talked about this, like going back to the battery thing. Like the batteries we're making right now are not, or at least obviously everything can be better, but like the batteries are an area where we could use a little bit of a boost.
They're totally sufficient for cell phones, even for like electric cars. But when we're talking about utility grid scale energy storage, it's a whole different ballgame. And
Yeah.
we are talking orders of magnitude greater requirements for energy storage here.
Yeah, like capturing that energy from any of these sources and then being able to transport them essentially
Yeah, and transportation is another very big issue.
to another place. All right. We're now Dr. Mullen, now we're getting into like a little bit of your realm here. This is the fun stuff.
Oh yeah, sorry,
Oh.
sorry, it wasn't fun before.
No, I didn't mean it like that.
Oof.
With Jeremiah, you talked about this in chapter 1 of the book. Let's talk about the Kardashev scale for the people out there that don't know what the
I
Kardashev
really love that
scale
you had
is.
that.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like,
The Kardashev scale is cool. So this is essentially a scale measuring how much energy a civilization uses every year, or is it just in general?
It's a logarithmic scale, so another one of those nonlinear scales that's kind of tough to criminalize. It's basically how much energy do you use, and that ranks your effective quality of a civilization.
Okay.
So this was originally put together by a Soviet astronomer, Nikolai Kardashev, and then it was since refined by Carl Sagan in the 70s. So first, let's stop and think of like what world they were living in at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Post-war, a lot of economic growth, a lot of enthusiasm, not much thinking about the environment.
A lot of
So
boomers just
it
kind
was-
of doing
yeah.
whatever they wanted to do.
Yeah, don't even get me started on that. So if you're thinking about this world, it's like, oh, we've just harnessed the power of the atom. We're not even worried about the environment. We can just punch our way through the earth with energy without thinking of any consequences.
Yeah, Atom Man.
Like look at the science fiction from that time. Look at the media from that time. Look at those educational film strips of like, this is the progress of man towards the future. Dun, 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 dun.
That was like Iron Man was invented around then. This
Yeah.
this.
But it was well understood that more energy use signified more advanced.
Okay.
That's what that meant. And it's like, it kind of makes some sense, right? It's
Sure.
like if you can harness more energy, you can do more stuff,
Right,
whatever that stuff
exactly.
might be. So what Kardashev and later Sagan did was kind of provide a numerical scale that related to how much energy you're using relative to some benchmarks of the universe. So type 1, Kardashev type 1, that's 10 to the 16th watts. That's about how much energy you can suck out of a planet like Earth, right? In some way, hand wavy. Type 2, that's the energy of a star. So that's 10 to the 26th watts or so, about. That's 10 to the 10. That's 10 or powers of magnitude above type 1. And then type 3, 10 to the 36 watts. That's a good chunk of a galaxy of stars. So another 10 to the 10, or 10 orders of magnitude past that. So nonlinear. If you kind of interpolate where we are, we're not type 0 because that would be like cavemen. We're not type 1. We're about 0.73, which is not 73% of the way there. It's a nonlinear scale.
Right.
So
So it gets bigger as you go. Like
Yeah.
0.8 is not just 0.07 bigger than where we are. It's an exponential.
So I know, like, I did the worst possible thing and like bring a bunch of graphs for a podcast.
it's like when Lex Friedman printed out the memes and he had memes on paper, like, and he was can you review this meme, and it's on paper.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
No, it's
I'm the
okay.
worst.
It's useful for us.
I'm a
Alright.
fan personally.
Yeah, I
All
like
right,
this.
So
This is cool.
This is from some research that I did a couple years ago in a talk I gave last year here at Point Park. So, it's easy to find our energy consumption through the ages. And it turns out if you plot it up, we've been using about, and this number I keep coming back to, 2.6% per year. I round it to 2.5 because that's easier to say.
Sure.
But on average, it varies between 2 to 7 in some cases. That's that post-war 1950s sort of like, yay, we're all going to fight the commies.
Early or China in like early 2000s.
Yeah, exactly. So like, like we're here 2 times 10 to the 13th at about 2.73. And if you extrapolate where we're going kind of from the last 200 years into the next 200 years or so, we hit type 1 somewhere mid to like about, let's see, what was it? The year 2260 or so. That's when we
22
hit
was when we become and now
that's a type 1. So that's like we are masters of the earth.
right.
Now, I think the main point that I want to make, and we can come back to the details about all this, is that I've looked at what the planet looks like when you use a planet amount of power. What people forget is that what did we learn from Spider-Man? Great power comes great responsibility.
Yes,
right?
we did
And what
learn
we
that.
learned from Newton's laws in the 1700s, right? With every
Yeah.
action comes a reaction. And that reaction inevitably requires heating of the planet by at least 12 to 14 degrees Celsius, a limit that is not survivable by humans. And that is like a wall that we hit when we get to about type 1. We cannot reach Kardashev type 1 without cooking ourselves off of the planet.
Right, and so type 1 is like type 1 is a single planet civilization, and then you get to type 2, which is...
Yeah, I mean, it's a little iffy because you can imagine, oh, what if we take over some other worlds and like colonize the moon and do all that stuff. So it's like, it's not the whole solar system, but it could be. Remember, it's just like how much energy do you use? It doesn't say anything about like
what you're doing.
Yeah.
But it maybe gives an indication of what your capabilities could be.
Yeah, but energy in is always energy out. So 10 to the 16th watts or thereabouts also tells you the rough degree at which of heat that you're giving off, which is about 10 to the 16th watts. Because energy doesn't get used up. We say we use it, but we really just borrow it as we transition it from one type to another.
Yeah.
And thermodynamics tells us that eventually it comes out as heat. Anyway,
Yeah.
Unless you're doing something really weird like building a giant space laser, then that's decidedly non-thermal. And it's more complicated than that. But the ways we use energy now, you can apply the laws of thermodynamics to the whole Earth system and get energy in, energy out. It's just like basically almost all heat.
Yeah. The space laser I'm also in favor of. I'm in favor of a lot of this stuff
Right
today.
now,
Okay with that.
just if you think about our current energy use, it's like if you take those old 60-watt light bulbs that you used to use for like IDEA,
Yeah.
and you put them all down and you kind of lay them on the ground and light them all up, you could light up the size of Rhode Island with the amount of energy we use collectively now.
Mm-hmm.
By this time when we hit type 1, thereabouts, that amount has grown to about the size of Alaska. And if you light up Alaska, you produce a heat lamp the size of Alaska, and that's that warming of the planet. That's from direct warming. Doesn't matter if you're using all renewable energy. Doesn't matter if you're getting all of your energy from solar or what have you.
It's still heat.
Yeah. This is just raw first law of thermodynamics. Everything we've been discussing up until now has been a second law of thermodynamics problem, or indirect effect on the planet. By monkeying with their composition of the atmosphere, we're trapping more of the heat that's already here from the sun. What we're doing here in the future is directly adding to that heat with what we're doing. So it's a little different, and it's not something people think about because, perhaps rightly, we are concerned about this one issue now, indirect heating, that's causing us trouble within this century.
Yeah.
Not something within the next 2 or 3 centuries. But it's something like if you're thinking about like long-term survival and flourishing of humanity, it's something we'll have to consider sooner or later.
Yeah. So that's been updated to now. Because before it was like there was like sort of names and like capabilities attached to the type 1, type 2, type 3 thing, but that's no longer the case. It's just
names.
Well, it was like from what I understood, type 1 was like a single planet civilization. Type 2 was a multi-planet civilization. Type 3 was like a galactic civilization, like based on the energy they could harness.
It's
kind of that gets kind of sloppy.
I don't want to weigh in on like what you would do with that, like because type 1, strictly speaking, is like you use an amount of energy that's about the same as a star.
Yeah.
So, what you do with that, like, are you spread throughout your solar system? Are you kind of hovering in an orbit around your star like a Dyson swarm? Like it's there are distinctions in here. It's just we're not going to talk about like what you're doing with the energy. It's just like how much of it you're using.
Right. For like context, it might not even necessarily mean that you're actually harnessing all the energy of a star. Maybe you're just harnessing the energy of like a million different planets, for example, right?
Yeah.
It's just,
I mean, you only have like 8 in our vicinity, but like for instance, let's imagine you found a way to turn that rest mass that every substance has by Einstein's E = mc squared into energy. Like, can't really do that easily. It's unclear how that would happen. But let's say, like, people much smarter than us 100 years from now can figure it out. Like, that rest mass greatly outweighs, if you wanted to disassemble like any decent sized planet in our solar system and turn that mass into energy directly, that would outweigh the amount of energy you get from the sun. So it would be like, that's not a Dyson swarm, that's something else, but
Right.
bye Mercury,
Right.
So.
Which again, would we miss it? Would we miss Mercury?
Probably.
We'd probably miss
feeling
Mercury.
our
Well-
orbits would probably suffer a bit, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a change, but it's not that big of a deal. I think at that point, like, we'd probably be less concerned about
That's
that
probably
sort of thing. The thing I would worry about, though, is that you can never discount the fact that life is found wherever you look on Earth, even the weirdest conditions.
Yeah.
So, is there a chance that, like, especially a planet like Mars, it's like, do we have the right to take all of its resources or destroy it in the quest for our own greatness? Like,
Yeah, that
there are
was
microbes there. Do we have that right? If there's possibility of microbes there, do we have that right?
Yeah, that was my next question. Was like,
Yeah.
how do you balance out the moral
Well, it depends
situation
on,
of colonizing the solar system?
philosophers have all sorts of ways to discuss this. I think like the thing that bothers me is that there's one branch of philosophy of utilitarianism where, in the last paper I wrote about this, there's the end conclusion of this is that if there are let's just give round numbers here, like 1 trillion people with a life satisfaction score of 1, that adds up to 1 trillion, right? But let's compare that to hypothetically like 1 billion people having a life happiness score of 99, right? What's better? More people being miserable than fewer people being happy. That's I forget what it's called, but it's like it's like the terrible conclusion or the distasteful conclusion. I don't know. Philosophers have a better repugnant conclusion. That's what it's called.
Repugnant, nice.
That's a good,
Yeah.
it's a good, very philosophy. That's the word they would use.
So if you subscribe to that branch of philosophy, then like we need to multiply and spread out and make everything terrible.
I would like to add on to that because
Yeah.
I've actually done a lot of thinking, especially over the past year or so, kind of in this exact realm of philosophy. And I have not studied philosophy like enough, but I find myself continuously coming up with sort of like, especially like utilitarian ideas that I kind of like I started writing a second book almost about like utilitarianism before I knew what utilitarianism was. And then when I started doing my research, I was like, oh, never mind, this is already a thing. I don't need to write anything about it.
Yeah.
Similar thing with that. I've kind of been thinking about it a lot recently because it is repugnant? Was that the
Yeah.
word? It is a very repugnant conclusion to draw to. I think where some of these things go wrong, at least in my own framing, I've been thinking about how we can kind of use the same methodology, because I do think it's useful to try to quantify as many things as we can, even our morals. But I'm kind of have been wondering maybe where these things go wrong, because satisfaction is usually on a scale of like 0 to 10 usually, probably, or something like that.
Like when you go to the doctor, like how much pain.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering if it would be more useful to include negative values, and if that's like a better way of looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way it was expressed was like, 0 is just you don't exist, so there can't be
Right.
anything below that. But
Yeah, you can't. There can't be a negative. There can't be like the inverse of a
Right.
person.
But the thing that I worry about in all this is like the number I just gave you for when we would be set to achieve type 1 status,
60.
2260 or so. Like that's contingent on a constant energy growth rate of 2.5% per year. With all the stuff that I've been seeing about our increasing digital demands on our energy infrastructure, there's no reason that can't change to something higher. And I definitely see evidence that that's the direction it's going to be going, especially when you look at how often these giant data centers are being built and how much energy and resources that are being used. And frankly, like in our own lives, like I tried to think about how much energy I consume now than before I had a smartphone. And, like it's a little bit, the thing's not huge, but it does add up. And even if you change that to like from 2.6% to 7% per year, which doesn't sound like a big change.
It's a huge difference.
We're reaching type 1 status like a little shortly after the turn of the next century in the year like 2140 or so. And by that point, we had best figure out what to do about our atmospheric composition by then, because if we don't, we'll have compounding problems with indirect heating from climate change as we understand it now, plus direct heating from our own industry of just producing, of just doing what we do. You know, like when I modeled this out, you know, like a 7% change, like, you know, like with a business as usual scenario. So it's like the worst case of all forms of climate change impacting us at once. We're talking about, you know, like getting us into that death zone of the planet is not survivable to humans, like by the turn of the next century. So even if IPCC is concerned about like, okay, with just regular climate change, we could get to like 3 to 4 degrees warming and how bad that would be. Like if you add direct heating into the mix, which nobody tends to think about, like that makes the problem even worse. Like that is doomsday for us as a species. And whether that means like we become robots, live below the surface, go somewhere else.
Yeah,
you know?
and with no obvious solutions as well. Like climate change, the solutions are frankly obvious. They're difficult, but they're obvious, right? But that's like, you know, how do you engineer around that? Do you add heat sinks to the planet, right?
Yeah. I mean, the only thing, because this is the good simplicity about this is that there's only one input variable to worry about. It's how much do you use and the rate at which you use it. And the only way to make this problem go away is to scale down that growth rate to 0. Right? And one way to do that is kind of this S curve we were talking about before, but in a different context. It's a logistic curve, and that just means like figure out some maximum amount of energy you want to use as a species. Right? But notice how like this goes completely against capitalism. Economic growth seems to be well coupled with energy use, right? It kind of makes sense. They both grow at about 2% per year.
Yeah.
And so you're going to go to every boardroom in America, in the world, and say, hey, we need to put the brakes on economic growth and therefore energy use and dial it back to 0.
Right.
Like, who's going to go for that?
Yeah. I mean, do you think that
No
this is
one.
a great filter?
Ooh, I think I like that question. I'm not sure. I subscribe to a couple of different possibilities for the Fermi paradox. One is that intelligent species are common in space but rare in time, so we don't overlap in any significant way. But all of this makes me consider the possibility that there's some version of the sustainability solution involved, and that civilizations like ours, who can kind of see the numbers plain and clear, the ones that survive plan for this. They don't build Dyson swarms. They don't do they don't use type 1 amount of energy, 10 to the 16 watts or 10 to the 26 watts. They don't become type 2. Sorry, that's a Dyson swarm. And that's a sort of energy use that we could see at interstellar distances.
Right.
So if we can't see them, if we don't see any evidence that there's any Dyson swarms or anything higher out there, when very clearly as an astronomer, I've looked at this, we should have seen them. I think that's one possible shove. I don't want to say it's like this means that, you know, all civilizations must be sustainable. I just think it's an interesting lens through which to look at our own path and say, hey, if no one else could figure this out, we're on this path to type 1 to type 2, and I see a barrier in our way. Maybe that's true for others too. And
yeah, you mentioned that in your TED Talk. You were like, because you spent time looking.
I probably did a
for
better job
Dyson
explaining it there.
swarms. No, it was fine. But Dyson swarms are going to be very hot. So you would look with infrared light out into the galaxy, out into the universe, and you would hypothetically see a star with a heat signature way higher than it should have.
No,
not like that.
Stars are definitely hotter. They just have a little bump that has to do with just being surrounded by a shroud of things that are.
Oh,
partly
I guess that's what
absorbing
I was
light.
saying. Like you're looking for where there's going to be a little bit of extra heat because all of those, like a Dyson swarm, for anyone that doesn't know, is essentially the concept of building giant solar panels that are launched into the orbit of the star to capture more energy, and then you have to harvest it somehow and bring it back, and that's a whole thing. But that's going to raise some alarms if you're looking out there. And we've never found any.
No, I would have told you by now.
Yeah, well, I told you
Yeah.
you had to tell me if you found the
yeah.
aliens.
So I think with with any other study like this, like you just explore a certain parameter space of possibility of other civilizations. So when you don't find something, you just kind of check that off the list and be like, okay, well, no one's doing this very specific thing. Let's try something else.
Right.
So for me, as someone who's followed environmental issues for a while and then became a astronomer, it really just made me think back to our history on Earth and what our choices are, what those choices mean for our future. Because for me, like, I see a very firm barrier in our way getting to type 1 that will prevent us from ever becoming a type 2. And it makes me wonder, like, did other people try and just couldn't do it? Or were they smart enough not to do that? And if we're surrounded by other civilizations, they just figure it out? Or was there a great filter that filtered them all out and you just can't win against thermodynamics?
Can you guys explain the Great Filter for those who don't know what it is? Or the concept of it?
Oh, sure. Well, basically, it's an idea for why we don't see other civilizations, and there are a couple of filtering points along our history that have to do with various astronomical, geological, biological things that conspire to make intelligent life that expands to the rest of the galaxy possible. So consider all the things that we had to survive, right? Asteroid impacts, perhaps even a gamma ray burst or two, life starting and surviving, and the fact that we have a nice moon that stabilizes our rotational period. Tectonic plates, yeah. Thanks, geology.
Which just so there's no confusion, may be important because you need to like cycle nutrients and like materials through the environment. Otherwise, if you had no tectonic movement, everything, like all the crap that piles up from us might just kind of like get piled up on top and nothing else would happen with it.
Yeah. And then lastly, like, what does intelligent life do? Does it kill itself off in so many different ways? If you read the literature from like the 70s, they're worried about all sorts of weird things like genetic degradation, which plays a little like dog whistle racist to me.
Yeah, that's true.
They're also worried about overpopulation, which is funny because that's actually less of a concern now than it used to be. But energy use is still a big concern. But there could be like something in our immediate future that prevents us from becoming a galactic civilization. And perhaps that's baked into the laws of physics. Like we've been struggling against thermodynamics since the development of the heat engine. Our problems with monkeying with our atmosphere have to do with ultimately the second law of thermodynamics. Yeah. And then we need to solve this law of the first problem of thermodynamics, but you can't break physics. So maybe it's just, like this is how it is. Or maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But to answer your question, it's just like there's these possible kind of pinch points that a emerging civilization may hit. And, it filters out all the civilizations over time. And, maybe we just, that's just it. Like we don't see anyone because they can't make it. Or maybe the filter is in their future. Right?
Sure.
And if we all start at about the same time, like maybe if we've all passed, if the big filter is in our past, then maybe we'll run into each other in the future and be like, "Hey, how'd you guys do with the first law of thermodynamics?" And be like, "Oh, we figured it out."
Right.
Yeah. Well, I like the word. Well, you've multiple times at this point you've said monkeying with stuff, which I'm gonna add to waffling in my my for now. I'm gonna add that. I like saying monkeying with stuff. It's kind of fun. Yeah, but so I'm wondering, is it now? This might be a silly question because the laws of physics do, as far as we know, work everywhere in the universe. Every civilization is going to have to deal with the laws of thermodynamics. Yeah. Is it possible that no one else thought of doing a Dyson swarm? I know that sounds
No.
narcissistic, but it's like, is it possible that we're the only ones that came up with that idea?
No, I don't think so, because I think it's kind of the obvious solution. Because if you're looking for a lot of energy, like we've learned of the possibilities of nuclear energy, and the star is basically a giant nuclear reactor that's just giving its energy away for free.
Yeah.
So like, why invest all this intellect into trying to build your own thing if you have a star there just to do it for you? So I don't think so. I think part of the strength of looking into the future, as long as you're just kind of being vague about it, as we're doing here, is that all it relies upon is a projection of what our energy growth rate is going to be, and the fact that energy doesn't disappear; it goes somewhere, right? And there's limitations to like how clever you can be about that, and that ultimately narrows the possibility. It's not like the future is wide open and we could be like this, or we could do that, or we could do, it's just like, actually physics is very constraining. There's only so much you can do. And what I'm saying, it's like, if you stay on Earth and do what we do, it will be very bad for us in 100 to 200 years. And I don't think anyone's really going to disagree at this point. But then like, survivability is possible, but it's then like, it's a matter of choice. Like, okay, do we want to keep doing what we're doing and facing a possibility that we have to live underground and never see the outside world because it's too hot for humans to live, and that we've killed off all of our crops and we've killed all the other plants and animals of this world? And is that what we want? Like, it's a way to survive. Do we want to live in the metaverse?
I do.
I mean, like, just like how every day I see people who choose to live their lives by just mindlessly scrolling through TikTok. It's like every time you do that, like, you make that choice towards that future.
Right.
And I think like what we need to have is a conversation of like, what do we want our future to look like? If it's not that, if it's something that's more of like a ecological utopia that, all like you've seen on like Star Trek episodes and stuff, but then it's going to require different choices. And I think it's going to require a really hard look at how we use our energy in telling people, no, you actually can't scroll mindlessly on TikTok if you want a better future for your children and grandchildren.
Yeah. Is human nature the great filter for us?
Gosh.
I mean, quite possibly tribalism, maybe.
Yeah,
my
our inability to understand anything besides a linear fit to data.
Yeah. Or even in linear terms, like, we still can't look more than a few years ahead.
Yeah.
Like, even if everything was going to stay the same for the next 100 years.
That's what we talked about a year ago, when I was like, I'm worried, our species was the wrong one to emerge. Like, would Neanderthals have done a better job?
Right.
Could they have thought more collectively about things and mindfully? I think.
Who knows?
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. Please.
I was just going to say, I've been wondering if, well, maybe it's not going to be our decisions for much longer. What if we do create some sort of more intelligent being than us, and we kind of give the reins off to them to, at least in part, make some more decisions for us for our collective benefits.
Yeah. I mean, I've been seeing part-time work available for people who want to train AI to do physics, and I like to hope maybe it's so they can solve really complex problems of what to do about planning our long-term energy and infrastructure. But
well, that's my thought, is like, even if, let's just say we did decide to build the Dyson swarm, you could not do it with the current structure of our civilization. Everyone would have to work together. Right? It's not going to be the Western world building the Dyson swarm. We wouldn't own it unless we would, and that's crazy. Wouldn't humanity have to collectively come together and say, we're going to put aside all of our petty tribalism and all of our
now it's going to be owned
wars
by
over
Elon Musk, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I mean,
Right,
it could be
Or
like
Wayland Yutani or something.
So is Elon going to own the Dyson swarm? Because that's my thought. Is like, is human nature the great filter? Because we can't get over tribalism right now.
Yeah, I mean,
we
I don't
can't
I
even
don't
figure
think
that
it
out.
has to be a collective thing. I think it should be one, though, right? Like, it
Okay.
could be a mega corporation with 1 billion employees mining mercury and sending all the materials off to build the swarm in front of the star.
Let's say send the robots to mine mercury.
Yeah, more realistically, it would be robots, probably. Yeah, but
So I guess a corporation could. Well, that's even spookier.
it would have to be by far not even close, like the biggest corporation ever, or entity probably ever created, just because the amount of material that we're talking about moving would be astronomical.
Well, America could do it.
Yeah.
America could build the we were good at corporations. We could build the Dyson swarm.
I mean, I would just like to say though, like, it doesn't. Our future doesn't have to be Dyson swarm. If you just look at the raw numbers, like I said before, we're using 1/10,000th of the energy of the sun, just to give it a really rough estimate. If we were doing anything with our planetary albedo or reflectivity, basically, or our emissivity, basically how blanketing we have from carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, then you can actually bump that up to, let's say, to like 1% or so before you have to start worrying about direct heating. So that's like another factor of 100. You can envision a world where we use about like 10 to 100 times more energy than we do now. And if we use it smartly, and carefully, we don't have to be too worried about any additional environmental impacts. It's like, that's a lot.
Right.
So I'm not saying it's like we all need to like give up hot showers and, bananas, stuff like that. But, it's like, I think we should resist the urge to be like, well, okay, how do we get from here to Dyson swarm? Because that has to be the answer. And
Right.
and there, fine, we figured it out on Earth. Like, then it's possible to go occupy Mars and spread ourselves around the solar system a little bit to make sure that if anything happens, like all of our eggs are not in one basket.
Right.
And, it's just the only thing we need to give up is that at some point our growth rate goes to zero in terms of our energy use. And likely that means our economic growth rate and most likely our population growth rate too.
That's my thought, is like, that's the human nature part. We love the latest, greatest stuff. We're constantly wanting to grow. So if eventually you have to tell humans don't improve.
Well, I mean, I don't think most people are, if I can be cynical about it, are too concerned about improving. Because, like, imagine telling someone from 1,000 years ago what the internet can do.
Right.
All the
It
knowledge
is
that
insane.
you can access and all the ways that you can grow your skill set. Do people use the internet for that purpose for the most
No,
part?
they don't. That's a good point. They don't.
I would like to say something, a thought that it just occurred to me in terms of like the Dyson spheres and the Dyson swarms and whatever. I'm not so persuaded that, I think that especially all of like this thermodynamics is very important. There's really like no way around that as far as we see right now. But, in terms of like the specific technologies like that, I'm not sure that we're quite asking the right questions, because I feel like a Dyson sphere is just kind of like our almost like sci-fi, the biggest thing that we could imagine.
It's like the ultimate.
To do. Right, but we are missing physics today still, right? Like I have a feeling that a more advanced society probably just has better ways of getting a lot of energy.
Less than you think. I mean, if you look at the another growth rate for you, the growth rate of important discoveries in physics, particularly like thermodynamics and particle physics, like that's leveling off.
Sure.
Like if there is a gain to be had, it's going to require like another tenfold increase in computation, because a lot of these are like complex nonlinear problems that like our brains just are done with.
The AI is going to have to do it.
I'm
for us.
specifically thinking in the terms of like dark matter, dark energy right now.
Yeah,
Like, there's sort of a black box thing I still don't understand.
Yeah, considering that's most of what the universe is, that does pose an interesting, like what the dark sector.
Right. I mean, it was 95% of everything pretty much.
Yeah, it's like, it's like 75% of the universe.
Something ridiculous.
So like in the studies I was involved with, when we did the first white paper for it, it was like, like looking for a Dyson swarm is the astronomically easy thing to do now, because we have space telescopes that have looked in infrared, and we can see this very discernible infrared bump in the spectrum, and it would only be this thing and this thing alone. So that made a very nice, like, easy, let's just go do that.
And I think it's worth looking at, to be clear.
Yeah, and like I said before, if you think about like a million-dimensional parameter space of what aliens could be doing, this is one tiny corner that we just checked off, and there's a lot of other things. for me, it just made a very it just made me reflect on our civilization because, like it's not that long until we need to consider building a Dyson swarm. And at the rate we're going, that's like the best source of energy
Right.
we
I
have
understand
right now.
what you're saying.
But dark sector would be really interesting because not observable, right? Or something like the Penrose mechanism,
I don't know.
harnessing energy from black holes.
Move a little closer to
is
the mic.
Okay.
rotational
Gotcha.
energy from black holes.
Yeah.
So it's like there's still a lot of interesting possibilities out there. There's a lot of really interesting science fiction to read
Yeah.
about all of it. And so I'm not going to say like our future is dim, but I would say that at the rate that we're going in the direction we're going, like it doesn't look good. To get to another direction, we need to pivot. We need to embrace collective action, and we need to embrace thinking on scales longer than the fiscal quarter.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to go back to like the Fermi paradox concept kind of thing. So I didn't realize this, but apparently our solar system is very peculiar because we have 4 rocky planets close to our sun and then 4 gas planets far away from our sun.
Mhm.
Why is that? Is that just odd because of how planets form with all of the...
Well, you have to think about the history of how these things were discovered. The observational techniques that we use to discover exoplanets, there's a couple of different ones, and you combine them in different ways to get the information that you want. But they're particularly sensitive to big, massive planets that orbit close into their stars, so they have a big effect on how those stars act, basically.
Yeah.
You look at the indirect effects on the star.
Mhm.
So those things, the weird solar systems were discovered first. And it's going to take some time to flesh out the solar systems that look more like ours, because if you want to discover things like Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune around other stars, those planets take many, 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 many years to go around. So to detect that effect on a star takes that many years.
There's
Yeah.
a sampling bias.
Yeah, it's a sampling bias. So that's part of it. However, we were very surprised of the diversity of solar systems. Part of it has to do with this gravitational migration, this planetary migration effect, where depending on when your star flips the on switch as it's formed, that determines when the star puts out a lot of energy in its solar wind that kicks out the gas and dust that the planets are forming around.
Mm-hmm.
When that disk of hot protoplanet stuff is still there, it creates these gravitational wave tugs that bring forming planets closer.
Okay.
So depending on when that on switch is flipped, your big planets could be out here, they could be in here.
Okay.
So there's going to be a range.
I mean, we found super Jupiters orbiting like closer than Mercury.
Yeah.
To our star, right?
Yeah, with like crazy stuff like liquid glass rain.
Yeah, I've heard
it's just,
about
it's
this,
gnarly.
yeah.
That's insane. Liquid.
But
gra-
one type of planet that we're seeing a lot of now, that all the Kepler Space Telescope data have been analyzed, and we're starting to like see more with the Jimmy Webb. Remember
the
that?
Jimmy Webb. Yeah, the Jimmy Webb's still out there.
Super Earths, mini Neptunes, or Hycean worlds. One of the most dominant types of planets out there is not terrestrial. It's not ice giant. It's like somewhere in the middle. So right now it's still kind of up in the air whether that's like kind of a big ocean world with a thick atmosphere or more atmospheric world with something weird going underneath.
Mm-hmm.
But that's seems to be like, if you rank the types of planets that are out there, that seems to be number one at this point. It's called Hycean because it's a portmanteau of hydrogen and ocean.
Does Hycean not sound like an alien civilization?
It does.
Like,
Hycean sounds like a drink that they would sell
Yeah.
at Sheets.
maybe.
So, the question there, like going back to plate tectonics, it's like, is there some geological activity that's bringing ocean, which is water, which is a universal solvent, in contact with nice salts and dirt and stuff, which is like the ingredients of life?
Mm-hmm.
In some cases that may be true, in some cases not. At high pressure, that ocean world actually turns to ice before you hit the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, it could be life, we don't know, but not so.
Yeah,
This is an
yeah.
issue with oh man, I'm forgetting the moon. One of Jupiter's moons. Maybe it's Io.
Yeah, Europa.
Europa,
probably,
right? Is it not true that when you have like so much water that might be so dense on some of these planets, it may be like ice, and then doesn't the pressure become so great that it may have to be water at a point? Because
Yeah, water is a little funny. You can actually get these concentric rings of water to ice to water to ice,
Right.
just because of how at these extreme pressures, water molecules arrange themselves, so they actually become solid before technically a liquid. Same thing with hydrogen, actually. Like the core of Jupiter and Saturn, like there's this liquid metal hydrogen layer, technically liquid, but that's what happens at that extreme pressure. Or even
Interesting.
in places like neutron stars, like you get weird layers of things that are in states that you wouldn't ordinarily expect because of the extreme pressures, but that's just physics being wild.
Yeah, that's. Well, I think that was when I took your class. That was. Now, I think maybe I sent a mission to Titan.
Yeah.
I think I went to Titan and I had to drill through like 67 miles of solid ice with a laser.
Yeah.
That was my plan.
I know that people have suggested for Titan, like using small nuclear reactors to like just provide heat to just kind of like melt through all of it.
Melt through it, and then they'd melt underneath them, and they just fall through in the end. It's like, oh well,
I guess
reactor's gone. I don't know.
Ask
Um,
NASA.
But yeah, it's interesting. We've been in a fortunate situation. We have a nice moon. That, from what I took a class, remember our moon is not usual.
No.
For us to have a big rocky moon like that.
Yeah.
We have it's kind of a special case.
Yeah, it's because we were punched in the face by a Mars-sized protoplanet early in our development.
Yeah.
Is that Thea?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, our moon does a lot. It's kind of a gravitational shield, so it seems intermittent asteroid and cometary impacts are good because we're here and the dinosaurs are not.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't want them too often because then you're just resetting the switch every time, and that's a great filter, perhaps.
Yeah.
The moon is also a good stabilizing agent. You know, like part of the reasons why we've had ice ages is because you get a tiny little shift in your axial tilt of the Earth's rotational axis, and over time that actually throws everything off and kind of tells you why our climate system is so sensitive, right? So, like, you know, we do have some wobble, but it's not extreme. You would get more extremes if we didn't have a moon. So it's things like that. It's like we have this moon. It's very big. Most other moons are just captured space junk like asteroids. Like Mars's moons are just little space potatoes. And so when you think about like how that moon formed, what an interesting and perhaps rare event that might have been.
Yeah.
You know,
It's
does
very
make you
rare for
think.
planets at the size of Earth and Thea that are that developed to collide, correct?
Yeah, because we're talking like the late heavy bombardment period. You know, like these worlds were already formed. They're kind of molten and kind of not there yet. But like when worlds are when protoplanets are forming, like you're gonna get impacts. Like things stick together, and that's how they build up. But at that stage, to have these like two big things collide like that, like one would think that that's not the most common thing to happen among forming solar systems.
It would be really cool to have seen, though,
Yeah.
from like an outsider perspective.
The wildest thing, though, is when you look at the numerical models that put these things together, it's like you expect this to play out for a long time, but like under 1,000 years, like once you smack Earth in the face, like you've got a moon. Like it doesn't take that much time.
Wow.
Yeah. And this has all been confirmed by samples of the moon, which when you analyze, if you're a geologist, you find that it's basically the same as Earth's mantle.
Interesting. Yeah, well, so that's how they figured it out. Yeah.
So it like we know geologically that it basically sheared it off. Yeah.
and so that's all because you talked about in some point in the book how like humans took advantage of an unusually stable climate situation and a unusually stable solar system in order to get where we are now.
Yeah, an interglacial period.
Right.
Yeah.
So that could also be a great filter.
Yeah.
It's just that life doesn't get a chance to start because the universe is throwing rocks at it.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have a nice moon to kind of help, or Jupiter.
And to
does
Jupiter,
it.
Jupiter to keep you safe and.
You know, and when you said we talked about our climate's stability, the interglacial period, and how sensitive it is. I mean, I worry still that that's underappreciated, because I think when you list out all the things that affect our climate and how they affect them, there's a lot of positive feedback loops.
There's a
and
lot of
there's a lot of,
feedback.
and I think with one thing that we didn't know about until recently was the effect of aerosols from pollution, where like in 2020 pandemic when we were shipping less, there's less aerosols from the diesel fuel or whatever that the big shipping vessels produce. And that actually not having that solar radiation management effect actually made our planet measurably warmer. So there's and then plus if you ask any climate scientist, how does all of this affect clouds? They go like this, like, oh God, because it's like such a huge, complicated mess to throw clouds. You know, the fuzzy things that you guess at their shapes in this. Some reflect light better than others, and then messing with our atmospheric composition messes with the distribution and type of clouds that you get, and that could really have a huge impact on the climate. It's such a crazy sensitive thing, and how lucky we were to be in the time of relative stability that we were.
Yeah,
but
it's really easy to just totally throw off course. I
Yeah.
mean, like you were saying about clouds. Like clouds both cool and warm the planet in like extremely complex ways, depending on, a myriad of factors. And I feel like I should explain like what's going on with aerosols here, because like aerosols typically cool the planet by reflecting more sunlight versus CO2 and other greenhouse gases warm it. So what's interesting about this, though, is that a lot of aerosols are formed alongside fossil fuels when we burn them. Kind of an interesting, one of the most common ones is like sulfur dioxide is like a pretty potent cooling effect on the planet. But ironically, sulfur dioxide comes pretty frequently with like the dirtiest types of coal. So it'll both be creating a lot of greenhouse gas emissions and a lot of sulfur dioxide emissions. This is interesting because the important thing about sulfur dioxide is that it was what was the leading cause of like acid rain and that kind of stuff back in like the 60s, maybe like the 50s to 80s period, I would say.
Yeah.
And kind of like a funny quirk in our industrialization, I would say, was when the Clean Air Act came, in part to address acid rain, it added scrubbing machines to these coal plants so that we would not be emitting so much sulfur into the atmosphere. And like unintentionally, we may have actually increased the rate of warming on the planet by alleviating another environmental catastrophe that was being caused by it, right?
So it's just all
it's all a big soup.
a little closer to the mic.
It's all
Sorry.
like none of it's like intuitive, I would say. It makes sense, but it's not intuitive, right? It's crazy complex.
The way that I try to describe it in physics, it's like a pendulum, right? So imagine a pendulum. It's like the most regular, predictable thing that you can imagine in physics, okay? But the problem is it's a very easy equation that determines its motion.
Yeah.
But once you start adding in things like friction or what we call damping, then things get wild. And then when you add forcing, then it gets really weird. If you add forcing at rates that don't match the pendulum frequency and certain amounts of damping, like you get all sorts of weird things, like it rolls over. It's one of the first examples of classical chaos. And by chaos in physics, I mean tiny little change in input variable leads to like wild range of outcomes that are really tough to predict. Now, the climate system is like, you think of it as a pendulum in terms of seasons and like certain hemispheres, but it's also connected to other pendulums that have to do with like, say, cloud cover, and other pendulums that have to do with like what plants are doing. And then there's the water cycle pendulum, and then there's
solar flares.
I mean,
all those
quite
other
literally
stuff.
hundreds.
It's all
It's
hundreds of them.
It's just complex series of pendulums forcing each other and damping each other, and they're all like going wild, and we're trying to understand all of it as we are. And you use this language in the literature. It's forcing, anthropogenic forcing.
Yeah.
Like we are pushing on our climate through all of these pendulums that are really, really hard to understand.
I never thought about that word in that sense before, but yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It's
damp-driven harmonic motion, but like with a million pendulums that are all connected in really weird ways.
I love that analogy. I'm gonna steal that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. since we're still in space, now we can open the asteroid mining. Now we'll briefly touch on this before we jump to something else. This has got to be very expensive. It's got to be expensive, and also my thought is like,
Yeah, but you get a lot in return.
they're all moving. Well, here's my thought is, let's say you send stuff up there to go get an asteroid, and you mine it, but it's moving. Do you catch it when it's in the orbit of Earth, and then how long do you actually have to mine? Am I looking at this the wrong way? Like, in my brain, it's like, isn't the asteroid moving really fast?
Yeah, I mean, everything's moving really fast.
Yeah.
You know, like, I forget how fast, like, the International Space Station is moving around, but the
I
orbit.
think it's like 17,000.
Yeah, it's
something
like
ridiculous.
It orbits several times a day.
Yeah. I think it's like 90 minutes or something.
Yeah, it's
Is
crazy.
a day for them. Yeah, so everything's moving fast, and that's why we have rockets, because, you know, you have to change your relative speed to something else, and that's why all of our spacecraft take forever to get anywhere, because they're always like making loops around things and catching energy from planets. Basically, they're stealing their orbital energy by taking a pass around them and
Yeah. Like
altering their
slingshotting
trajectory. Yeah.
themselves.
Getting like gravity assists
Yeah.
and whatnot.
So I mean, it's the same sort of thing with that. You know, it's just like a classical mechanics problem to solve. I would say like it's a huge investment, but if you add up, you know, the cost of the, you know, the rare earth elements and all sorts of goodies that you get on return, like your investment does come back. It just takes a while.
Yeah, those asteroids are full of lithium, cobalt, gold. Like I'm blanking on other, but it's like these are full platinum. Like they're full of stuff. We'd rather get it from there than digging it up of the ground here on Earth.
I think it's like a lot like our industrial history to date. You know, it's like before we used to mine and have dirty plants and produce things industrially locally, but then we offshored that to other countries, and this is just another sense of offshoring. It's just, you know, space shore.
and this is something that I'm actually very like upset about on the front of asteroid mining, because I do think that it's important for us. I mean, I think asteroid mining is going to be important because just fundamentally we have constrained resources here on Earth. Like we haven't mined deep into the Earth at all itself, but you know, just kind of fundamentally, we're going to have to get a lot of these, especially like heavy metals, from somewhere else. But we're still really bad at like recycling the materials that we have right now.
Oh yeah.
And I don't want to just
I see
keep
computer equipment on the side of the road ready for
Yeah.
the trash. I'm like, come on, man.
I don't
It's
want to
like-
just keep on piling crap on.
Yeah.
Even like regardless of like the environmental impacts, just like it's just a better way of doing things,
Yeah.
right? Like
Yeah.
we should just learn how to efficiently use our resources, because if you can efficiently use them, no matter what the total amount is, you'll just get a lot more work out of it in the end.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to our point of, you know, like mindfully thinking about what you want your future to be. Because if you want to produce and consume so much that you need to mine a lot of asteroids, then it's like, well, you got to solve that complex problem. And that's kind of what civilization is, right? It's like choosing what problems you want to solve based on the things that you want to do.
Yeah.
I always get bugged when, you know, we tend to choose problems that could have been solved by like just picking a different path of doing things. Like literally all of our food distribution is that,
Right.
you know?
I mean, I think about this quite literally in terms of like nuclear energy. I think that if we thought more rationally, we would have like the kind of like nuclear utopia that was put forward. I don't necessarily think that it would have been a utopia, but I do think that we missed like part of that in this because of like human irrationality, essentially. And I think that we would have actually had a better world if we had gone down that path more seriously.
Yeah.
We might skip over it in the end. We might go to fusion or something better in the future, but it, you know, probably millions of people have suffered because of that choice.
Or like to a lesser extent, the choices we're making about AI now. It's like we're all doing all this hand wringing about generative AI. It's like if we didn't make this stupid thing, then we wouldn't have this problem in the first place. And like people love to create. We're creative individuals. Like why would we? Maybe I'm not. You know, I'm probably just like talking out my butt at this point, and maybe I'm in the wrong. But
That's the entirety of what I do on this show.
I mean,
so
I'm
it's okay.
basically an android, so I take personal offense to you attacking the AI.
Well, it's you know, it's like why are we training all these GPTs and language models to do things that people like to do, like create art and literature.
That's what I'm thinking. Like, why are we
That's good.
having it do?
I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, but I don't like the idea of AI music or AI art.
But
I'm not
it's,
big
it's
on these
because our
things.
incentives aren't necessarily in the right place, right? It's
No.
because
Yeah.
we're incentivized to profit, not
Yeah.
necessarily to be happy.
Yeah. Capitalism, man. 2.5% per year again.
Another 2.5.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Doctor, if you haven't seen already, Jeremiah has an Occupy Mars hoodie on.
Yes.
He's a big Elon
I've
Musk.
referenced it a couple
He's
of
a big Elon Musk guy. From what I've talked to you about, you're not a huge fan. Well, I don't want to speak for you. I guess, what are your thoughts on Elon Musk as a person in our society?
I don't follow him all that much, so I'm not sure. Like, I haven't been on Twitter in a long time, and
Well, it's X now.
I don't
People-
recommend it.
people seem to think that change was bad. So
Yeah, I'm not a
I'm
fan.
not going to weigh on that. I don't know. I found his kind of like pissing contest with Bezos a while back to be kind of distasteful, and I don't know. Maybe I'm being too romantic about space exploration, where like I always envisioned it as a collective enterprise of humanity instead of like just corporations being like, my space dick is bigger than yours, you know?
I understand the sentiment, and
Yeah.
I may even agree with the sentiment, but I think in the reality of like all of human exploration is that it's never been a collective action. It's always been the people on the fringe.
Yeah, but that's why I said it
done
was overly romantic. And if you take a
Right.
a wide-eyed look at the reasoning behind Apollo, they left all these lovely commemorative things on the moon, being like, we came in peace and all that.
Right,
and it's
right,
like, well, you came here to say, haha, fuck you, communism.
Yeah.
Like, that wasn't. Yeah, that was the only reason.
Yeah. I mean, sorry, go ahead.
No, yeah. So I know Musk and Stephen Hawking, I think they had some conversation some time back, or at least agreed on this central point where it's like, we need to spread ourselves around the solar system, if only for humanity's survival. And I don't disagree with that.
Mm-hmm.
I just tend to disagree with how capitalism takes that and kind of ruins it for me.
Sure.
And I don't know if that's a Musk problem. I think that's just, like, I'm just kind of like a crusty old man now.
I don't know that
Yeah.
it necessarily like ruins it for me. I mean, I've kind of like trashed on capitalism a lot today. I'm like probably more a capitalist than a socialist, just because. I just think that some of our capitalist incentives are misplaced, right? I just think that we need to reorient our incentives, but that doesn't necessarily mean the structure of the whole economy.
Yeah, and I think to your immense credit here, I love that section in the book that said like, hey, I'm going to lay out all the ways that this is economically advantageous.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
of course.
It's just like the problem is that's harder to explain than money now, money now,
Right,
money now.
right.
You know?
Yeah, I will say, like, I've always appreciated that, is you've always tied these things to an economic benefit. There's always, I feel like every time I read a Substack article, it's always like, hey, this is how we're gonna make money off this. There's jobs, there's money, there's an incentive to do
And the
it.
reason for that is just because today, in our modern framing, most people have, throughout all of history, have just like been chasing the basic premise of like, okay, I want my kids to have a better life than me.
Yeah.
Right? I would say that's the premise. And today, that's kind of done through the realm of like, okay, is the economy growing? And the assumption, which is not always necessarily correct, and I don't think has been correct over the past, maybe 40 years, has been that, okay, economic growth leads to a better life for people.
Yeah.
So that's kind of why I try to frame it that way. But like I said earlier, I think that quality of life indicators is like going to be more important moving forward than just like GDP or something like that. But
We don't want the repugnant conclusion.
No, we don't want
Sure.
we do not want the
Right.
repugnant conclusion.
But
Not
this
at
is why it's important to at least like mention it, because unfortunately, as much as I would love to, I don't think that we're going to get over human nature anytime soon.
No,
And so
I
there
don't-
needs to be a very visceral drive and incentive to push people forward. And I just like to label things in economic terms because that's the incentive that we've kind of all signed up for collectively right now.
Sure.
consciously or not.
Yeah, I am kind of the belief that I don't think we're ever going to overcome human nature unless it is some sort of augmentation with technology, which I'm also not particularly.
I mean, I do think we will. Just so
I think we will too. I'm not looking forward to that, but I think that we will do it. So
I mean, we're already augments with.
Yeah, this is already an augment
with systems of microbes.
Yeah, this is an augment.
Your
technology.
gut is like
right.
2/3 bacteria or something, and you can't function without. So it's just you're augmenting yourself with something a little different.
That is true.
Yeah.
I don't want it in my brain though. Thoughts on Neuralink? Are you going to put the chip in your head?
Every time that we talk about this, I get more and more bullish on it.
You too.
First it was like, okay, maybe I would get the Neuralink when it's like, I'd be like the 50th percentile kind of.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was like, maybe I'll be like the 30th percentile. And now I'm like, I think I'd be in like the top 10.
You'll get it tomorrow.
Like not right away. I played a video game recently called what is it? Atomic Heart, I think, and it's basically like a sci-fi dystopian of
Yeah.
like where everyone gets like a microchip in their brain. It's like techno-Soviet utopian, I'd say. It's like supposed to be in the 70s or whatever. But anyways, the premise is that like everyone gets a microchip in their brain, and then essentially someone hacks it and like takes over the entire society. That's the premise.
Yeah.
And as I was playing through it, I was like, yeah, I mean, I see the point they're making to me, but I'm just not buying it. Like I still just can't get over.
Again, he thinks that it's him. He thinks that another Jeremiah is going to control the system.
Right,
He won't
that's
become.
the problem,
He won't
yeah.
become malicious and take over the system.
Yeah.
Okay, Jeremiah. Again, well, this is more of a question about the book for you. But again, if you have anything to add, please do. You talked a lot about in the book how we've got a lot of political stalemate. There's a lot of dirty money in politics. The Republican Party will be very dismissive of wind and solar in areas where it could be useful. The Democratic Party will shoot down nuclear. What did you learn about our political system, about people, about the nature of that system while writing the book and doing the research? And do you have any solutions to any of these things?
So, yeah, that's a really great point. I would say this was even maybe the primary driving force of why I wanted to write the book, even if I didn't recognize it at the onset of writing.
Sure.
Just in the sense that I realized that there is so much, misinformation in the realm of energy, particularly in climate change, but also just in every facet of our society today. And to me, it was not clear that it was coming from either like side of the political spectrum specifically, right? Like specific types maybe, or specific issues like, what did you say? Donald Trump quoting how wind turbines are killing all the birds.
I mean, that's one of my favorite.
Right.
He's on the Full Send podcast. He's like, these wind turbine fields, they kill all the birds.
Right. So like,
I was like, this guy is out of
specific
control.
issues and talking points may be tied to either party, but studies have found that neither political party is actually better at thinking in like scientific terms. And I think that, I was just kind of fed up with this idea, A, that, look, the other side gets it all wrong, and B, that I get it all right. Because those are two separate topics, right?
Yeah.
Like, I like to think I'm like a fairly smart guy. I like to make some, think big about like what the future could be. But I also recognize that, like, almost fundamentally, I can't have everything right. Like, I must be wrong about some things. I may not know what they are, but there's a sort of humility that we've lost, like, culturally there, right? And it was this humility and the degradation of it that I felt like I had to bring this up in the book. And this is why I talked about it right at the start, because we have to recognize that actually that those other people that you might think are crazy because they think the wind turbines are killing all the birds, they may be crazy for that, but they may have some good points on something else too, right? So we can't just wholesale kind of shove off, in the U.S., like, 160, 70 million people just because, like, they had some bad ideas. Like, newsflash, we've all got some bad ideas.
Yeah, everyone's got some like that. Yeah, I mean, that's something that's always bothered me, is that I have friends that are more conservative, that are more skeptical of climate orthodoxy, but these people don't hate the planet.
Right.
These people aren't all about, let me make sure. I had actually gotten the sentiment, it's hilarious when I say not to get too political on the show. That's my favorite thing to say because it's like, that's kind of like, you know what I mean? But I feel like especially people our age that are conservative are like, yeah, we don't really necessarily, I don't care as much about it's not all about the corporations and the profit to them. It's like there are other reasons why they're skeptical.
Right.
It's not that, and it's not all, and the other side, it's not that Democrats want to take away everything fun about life. It's like, this is not true at all.
And I've been
It's not.
talking about this a lot. I've been working in a lot of bipartisan work, obviously with like Bridge USA, but also some other organizations. I work with an environmental nonprofit. And I recently did a workshop on bipartisanship with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of made this point, which I was given, by a book that you recommended me, Monica Guzman's I Never Thought of It That Way.
Yeah.
And she frames kind of the whole issue in such a good way. Everyone cares about every issue, but we just have a different list of priorities.
Yes.
Right? That's the way to look at it. Like
That's the human values test that we took. I discussed
exactly.
it with Claire a
Right.
couple times. Yeah.
So like, even like the most like ultra like conservative people, they still care about clean air, clean water, right? Like nobody's saying that they don't. They, but they may care a bit more about national security, or they may care a bit more about like economic growth or something like that, right? So it's just a matter of how can we rectify all of these different issues that everyone cares about and find what works best for everybody. This is another reason why I like to bring up the economic reasons, because like it may not even be an argument that I like to bring up arguments that I don't even necessarily like appreciate myself, but I know that somebody else would, right?
Of course,
Like
yeah.
if it's a valid argument, it's worth bringing up because someone else may find more value in it than I would even.
Yeah.
Yeah, in science communication, we always try to figure out what is the one thing that our audience cares about anything, and like how do we bridge the gap between different audiences that would disagree about things. And usually the most common crux that we come to is that like we all want a better world for our kids and grandkids and all that.
Yeah.
Like if there's one universal thing of humanity, it's that.
Probably life as a concept.
Yeah. And like even when you're talking about the economic growth thing, it's like, well, for the purpose of what? It's so their kids have a better life, because historically economic growth has been linked to better lives, right? And like, so they're not wrong to want that, and they're not monsters. Even if I show them my work that says like, hey, like we hit this death wall by 2260, it's like, they're not horrible human beings for wanting more economic growth. They're just really wanting better lives for their progeny.
Right.
Yeah.
Nothing wrong with that.
Right.
This is a funny thing I wanted to talk about. Jeremiah, you brought up this idea of like existential risk in the book, and there was a sentence where you said that a self-replicating set of nanobots could just consume the planet, and then you
Grey
moved,
goo.
and then
Yeah,
you
the grey
moved,
goo, yeah.
and then you moved briskly on from that. You just mentioned that nanobots could escape and consume the planet, and then you were like, we gotta just move on to the next
Your problem
thing.
is just that I like mic dropped that.
Yes. Yeah, you just...
All right,
you
what's
did-
for lunch?
Not even a sentence, not even a follow-up. You just mentioned that the nanobots could eat the planet. I thought that was just kind of fun.
I'm no expert on nanobots, but it's just the stereotypical example.
Yeah,
I
it's
had
the
to throw it
usual.
in, yeah.
They could get out and they
Could
could
be
do
the great
some...
filter.
They could be the great filter. That's what we never thought of. We didn't think of all the civilizations making nanoviruses that would just
Well, if you
consume
think-
all the
if you-
plants.
If you think about that gray goo scenario, it's like, okay, it takes over all the planet, and then what? Like it can't. I mean, unless these things are more sophisticated, then I think they can't like build themselves rocket ships to send other
Right,
places.
right, yeah. It would be contained.
Yeah, so they're just kind of stuck.
Unless there was a, I'm forgetting the word. What is it, like permia? What am I thinking of?
Could an artificial intelligence...
Panspermia, yes,
Yeah, I mean,
thank
like if they'd have to wait for an asteroid to come and knock off a chunk of gray goo world
Sure,
to
right.
go somewhere else, and that's a pretty slow process.
Yeah, that is a slow process. Is it possible that AI could just kind of collect all the nanobots together and build them into a person, into a humanoid figure, and then they could start making spaceships.
Whatever you want to imagine is probably possible.
Yeah,
In my experience,
that's a slippery
human
slope.
imagination is consistently, dull compared to reality.
Yeah.
And
Oh
I've
yeah,
attached
especially when it
feelings.
comes to astronomical things.
Yeah, we could be here all day.
Yeah.
Jeremiah, a quote that you introduced me to a couple weeks ago that I really like is from Hans Rosling.
Mhm.
The world is both bad and better.
Yeah.
That's a great quote. And that's the thing you love. You love Jeremiah's. There's now an ongoing series on this podcast called the Best Time to Be Alive episodes. And it's just with our friends getting together and we just kind of, I don't even know what it is at this point. But Jeremiah loves to bring it up.
Yeah, like why if you had a time machine, time travels back in time is not possible. But if you could do it, like, would you? Like, no. Most times the history are shit.
yeah.
Like,
yeah.
if you were a
wouldn't.
rich white man, you could probably do fine. But like, if you're literally anyone else,
You're
like,
anyone else.
do not go back.
There's
in
a
time.
great quote by Barack Obama about this as well. And I forget the exact quote, but it's essentially along the lines of, if you had to choose a time to be born into and you didn't know where you would be born or what family or what economic class that you would be born into, you would choose right now. And I think he said you would choose to be born in America right now, but that's a politician.
Yeah.
That is. And this is the thing you brought up to me last night, this idea that our technology is exponentially growing at an exponent. See, when Jeremiah gets spooked about something, I immediately get spooked because he's like my gauge. Like, if Jeremiah is scared, then we should all be looking at me.
Exponential growth should always scare you.
But it's like, but the exponential growth is exponentially
Here's
growing.
the idea that I was hitting upon last night. I would love your opinion on this as well. We are going through exponential growth on pretty much whatever metric you want to put it as right now, right? But what I was thinking about was that there are so many multi-purpose, maybe like general purpose innovations happening right now. It feels to me like not only are we growing exponentially, like technologically, but I feel like they all create their own feedback loops on each other in ways that even the exponent of growth is growing exponentially. Like, instead of x squared, x to the 4th, x to the 16th each year, it's more like x squared, x 100, x a trillion each year.
Yeah.
Right?
You know, if I can give this some context, before I got into this work, I was inspired by the work of an astronomer named Sebastian von Horder, who was one of the SETI pioneers in the 50s and 70s. So he, basically the work that I've been doing has been kind of like a follow-up to see what has changed and what does that mean for our future. And for a lot of things like population growth, even energy use and climate disasters, like the doomsday time scale, if you want to call it that, gets pushed back further and further the more you look at this, which is inspiring, I think.
Yeah.
Because when he did these first predictions, he was saying like the world would end, like quotes here, doomsday just means a change. And like now, like 2025-ish, right? So we're still here, everything's fine. We haven't eaten all the food, we haven't overpopulated. But in his population example, the data he was looking at pointed to a non-linear growth rate in that exponential term. So, sorry. I keep forgetting that I have to basically drink out of this microphone.
No, it's not. It was not that.
Just don't look at me at all.
Whenever you're that's the tricky part, is whenever people haven't handled the once, you know what I mean, like understanding the microphone has to be in a certain position. I'm just trying to guide everyone. I don't mean to interrupt.
So if you have a growth rate that's constant,
we'll wrap up.
like 2.5% per year, that implies exponential growth. If it's a non-constant growth rate, that's faster than exponential, right? So mathematically, you can solve the differential equation that arises there. And so he did that with what he was looking at with growth, where with population, where the growth rate in population would increase. And so that meant there would be literally a singularity, an infinity amount of people by 2025. Which just meant that society would break down. It would be Soylent Green.
Right.
But that's one of the inspirations for that movie, Soylent Green.
Okay.
Which is why I always go to bat for it as one of the most accurate science fiction movies of its time.
I've never seen it.
Because it's based on legit predictions.
Okay.
So that's the sort of territory that we get into, a singularity, an infinite amount of something in a finite amount of time. So that's why we start worrying about like AI singularities and all that. And that's why I start to worry about, like the growth rate and energy use from all these digital tools that we're using, from Bitcoin to ChatGPT.
Sure.
And all of that. So sorry, I was jumping in to give context to something you were talking about, and I was being very rude. So
No, I think
No, it's
that's
okay.
a great point of context.
Yeah, but that's been spooking you.
but you know
Thinking
what?
about
It's
that.
been spooking me for about 24 hours.
Actually, can I add to your spook?
Yeah.
Being of that,
please
so
do.
Right.
this is more of like an existential thing. So, as I said before, the growth rate in our data center production has been 40% per year. And even though it's a small amount of energy compared to what we use for everything else, it's due to outpace everything by 18 years from now. And also, coincidentally or not, this is when the raw computational power of our devices exceeds the raw computational power of our biology. So if you consider ourselves to be genetic computers, you can calculate our computational power of every single person.
Mm-hmm.
And by a very real metric, in 18 years, we will be more machine than man.
I gotta. Yeah. All right. Well,
I mean,
let's,
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
let's give some concluding.
I'm sorry. Did
thoughts
that
here.
like you wanted to talk more about like the singularity?
No, I mean, I think that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we got it.
Spooky stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All right. What gives you both hope for the future now that we've brought all the doomer situations to the conversation?
Well, like I said before, my research showed some hard cutoffs for what to expect in terms of our future planet's ability to sustain us, which was sad. But when you compare it to when Sebastian von Horner was doing the same sort of thing in the 70s, you find that these timescales keep getting pushed back with time. And that, I think, is underappreciated. Like it used to be, we would run out of food, we would overpopulate the planet by 2025. We could feed way more people now than we could before. And actually, part of my work was just saying that, we have more than enough land to grow the calories we need to sustain our civilization. That's not a problem anymore. We still have some problems with energy and climate and all that, but those doomsdays, those thresholds keep getting pushed back because of decisions that we make now. And a lot of these decisions are being picked up on by the latest generation of humans, which are a lot more open-minded about some of the ways that capitalism has failed us and how we may need to tweak it in order to make everyone happy and make the climate issue better.
Right.
That's an accurate way to say it.
Yeah. I mean, I guess what gives me hope is we talked a lot about incentives today.
Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. We're running out of time on the camera over here. Just
give me 30 seconds.
Yeah, a quick. No. Okay. I'm sorry.
All right. I'm hopeful.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thanks, guys, for doing this. We got to wrap it up.
Sorry about that.
See you guys later.
Thank you.